Welcome to No Sleep Historian, where the past never rests, and neither should you. Between 1347 and 1351, a darkness fell across Europe that would make our worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. The Black Death didn't just kill, it transformed the very fabric of human civilization. 1/3 of Europe's population vanished into mass graves. But those who survived faced something perhaps even more terrifying. A world turned completely upside down. This isn't just another recounting of medieval mortality statistics. This is the survival guide they never wrote, the manual for navigating humanity's darkest hour that was passed down through whispered stories and hard-won wisdom. Because the Black Death wasn't just a historical event. It was humanity's first great test of whether civilization itself could survive the unthinkable. Tonight, we journey into that shadow. We'll uncover not just how the plague killed, but how some managed to live. How they preserved not just their bodies, but their minds, their communities, their very humanity when everything they knew was crumbling around them. This is Surviving the Black Death, Part 1. The calm before the corpse. Before the coughing, before the screams, before the endless tolling of bells stopped altogether and the air thickened with the stench of decay, there was calm. A fragile, oblivious calm that stretched across Europe like morning mist before the storm. In the early 14th century, the continent believed itself on the cusp of divine prosperity, blessed by God and protected by the sword. Trade routes hummed with activity, carrying silks and spices from distant lands. Kingdoms stood firm under banners of faith and steel. And the Church, omnipotent and unquestioned, guided souls from cradle to grave with promises of heaven and threats of eternal fire. For the average person, life was simple, brutish, and short. If you were born poor, you would die poor, your hands cracked from labor, your back bent from endless toil. If you were born noble, you would die slightly cleaner, perhaps in a bed rather than on straw. The average man lived by the sun's rhythm and died by the sword, or from a rotten tooth, or from the pox that swept through villages like wildfire. But despite its harshness, it was a life people understood. The seasons turned predictably. The church bells marked time. The feudal system, however oppressive, provided structure and meaning. The land fed them, even if poorly. The harvest festivals celebrated meager bounty with desperate joy. Ale flowed in taverns where men spoke of distant wars and local gossip. Children played in muddy streets, dodging horses and learning trades that would define their brief lives. Women bore children knowing half would die before their 5th birthday. Yet still they hoped, still they loved, still they planned for futures that stretched no further than the next harvest. The Church explained the sky, the storms, the suffering. Every plague was God's judgment. Every drought was divine punishment. Every blessing was earned through prayer and penance. The priests, draped in robes that smelled of incense and authority, offered absolution for a price. They built magnificent cathedrals that reached toward heaven, each stone a prayer, each spire a declaration that God was watching and would provide. The rhythms of life, however cruel, felt immovable. Sunrise brought work, sunset brought rest, Sunday brought worship, Monday brought labor again. The wheel turned, seasons changed, generations passed. Wars came and went, leaving scars on the landscape and stories in the taverns. But life itself, the fundamental pattern of existence, seemed as eternal as the stones beneath their feet. No one saw the shadow growing beyond the mountains, through the ancient forests, past the vast expanses of desert and river that stretched toward the edge of the known world. No one knew that on the far reaches of the earth, something ancient and patient had stirred in the blood of wild rats, then into the fleas that fed on their backs, something microscopic, unseen, and utterly indifferent to human prayers, human power, human hope. There was no warning that the Black Death had begun its inexorable crawl westward. No messenger arrived with news of distant calamity. No prophet emerged from the wilderness with visions of coming doom. There was only silence, the same silence that had preceded every other catastrophe in human history, until the corpses started to arrive by sea. But let's not rush toward that horror. Before the death ships sailed, there was a world very much alive, pulsing with ambition and energy. Across the legendary Silk Road, goods moved from the markets of China to the ports of Italy in massive caravans that threaded through hostile deserts and dodged bands of ruthless bandits. Spices that could preserve meat for months, silks that shimmered like captured moonlight, knowledge written on parchment and carried in the minds of scholars, and disease, always disease, moved together, hidden in sacks of grain, clinging to bolts of cloth, nestled in the fur of exotic animals, carried in the blood of merchants who had no idea they were already dead. Italian port cities like Genoa and Venice grew rich beyond the dreams of their founders. Their harbors bristled with ships from a dozen nations. Their marketplaces brimmed with treasures that would have seemed magical to earlier generations. Pepper from India, ivory from Africa, tea from China, amber from the Baltic shores. The air rang with a dozen languages, the sound of coins changing hands, the creak of rope and sail as vessels prepared for their next voyage. Literacy was spreading beyond the monastery walls. Merchants needed to read contracts, calculate profits, correspond with distant partners. Artisans carved a new kind of wealth from trade, their workshops producing goods that rivaled those of ancient Rome. In the growing cities, some dared to believe that God had truly blessed them with a new golden age of civilization and prosperity. Universities sprouted in Paris, Oxford, Bologna. Scholars debated theology and philosophy, while their students learned to read Latin and calculate sums. The Gothic cathedrals rose higher and more magnificent than ever before, their flying buttresses defying gravity itself. Art flourished in the courts of kings and the workshops of master craftsmen. It seemed that human knowledge and human power were ascending toward their divine destiny. They didn't understand that the same caravans bringing saffron and silk also carried the seeds of their extinction. The same ships that brought prosperity also brought doom. The same trade routes that connected the world also provided highways for death. And no one had prepared for the horrors that moved not with the thunder of horses or the clash of swords, but with the quiet persistence of fleas seeking warm blood. Somewhere in the vast openness of Central Asia, a sickness ignited inside wild rodent populations. The exact origin is still debated by historians, but what matters is not where it began, but what it became. The bacterium Yersinia pestis didn't care for politics or borders, for kings or peasants, for the saved or the damned. It simply needed a host. First, the wild rodents of the steppes, then the fleas that fed on them, then anything warm and breathing that crossed their path, including humans, especially humans. The Mongol Empire, enormous and ruthless, became the perfect vehicle for this invisible apocalypse. As the Mongol armies conquered territory and razed cities, As their soldiers moved across the land, so too did the disease, traveling in their supplies, their animals, their blood. In the early 1330s, China suffered outbreaks that killed millions, entire provinces falling silent, but no alarm reached Europe. No warnings crossed the deserts and mountains. No survivors bore news of the calamity. Just silence, the same silence that would soon blanket the world. Until 1346, when the plague reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa. Kaffa was a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula, a bustling hub of commerce where east met west. Ships from Venice mingled with caravans from Samarkand. That year, it came under siege by the Mongol army of Johnny Beg. But the Mongols had brought more than swords and arrows. They brought the plague as their own soldiers began dying, rotting from the inside, their bodies covered in black boils. Johnny Beg turned to a weapon of desperation and calculated cruelty. He ordered the corpses of his plague-ridden men hurled over the walls with siege engines, rotting projectiles of flesh and bone that burst among the terrified defenders inside. What followed was more than a siege. It was a contamination. Panic gripped the survivors as they realized that death itself had become a weapon. Genoese merchants, desperate to escape the horror, fled on ships bound for Italy, taking their wares, their wealth, and the invisible killer hiding in their clothes, their hair, the bellies of fleas crawling beneath their robes. No one on those ships knew they carried a death sentence. No one understood that their escape would become Europe's doom. They sailed toward home, toward safety, toward the ports that would become the first graveyards of a dying continent. When they arrived in the ports of Sicily and Genoa in 1347, dock workers unloaded more than exotic goods. The rats left the ships too, scurrying into the maze of streets and alleys. And with them came the fleas, tiny and hungry, seeking new hosts among the crowds of curious onlookers. Within weeks, the first to die were the workers who had handled the cargo, then the dockmasters who supervised the unloading, then their wives who prepared their final meals, then the children who played in the streets where infected rats had passed, then the priests who tried to console the dying families. From the docks, the plague moved inland, slowly at first, like a dark tide licking at the shore. It crept through the narrow streets of port towns, following the paths of commerce and human contact. But then it surged with terrifying speed. Within months, entire towns were infected. No one understood why. No one could explain how death moved so quickly through populations that had seemed healthy just days before. They tried to understand. The leading theory was miasma, the belief that disease spread through bad air, poisoned by sin or celestial misalignment. People clutched pomanders of crushed herbs, their hands trembling as they pressed the sweet-smelling mixtures to their noses. They burned juniper in their homes, filled their rooms with smoke that made their eyes water. They carried flowers to mask the stench of death that seemed to cling to everything they touched. Others turned to the stars. They drew elaborate charts, calculated celestial influences, and prescribed remedies based on the movements of distant worlds. Still others turned inward, forming bands of flagellants who whipped themselves in the streets as penance to God. Their backs bloodied in a desperate bid for divine mercy. The church, the only authority many people trusted, stumbled in the dark like everyone else. Some priests refused to administer last rites, terrified of the contagion that seemed to follow them like a shadow. Others died quickly, buried in the same pits as their congregations, their prayers unanswered, their faith unrewarded. The Pope retreated to Avignon and sat between two massive bonfires, believing the heat might cleanse the air around him. It didn't. Death found him anyway, taking his physicians, his servants, his closest advisors. Most were worse than useless, their treatments based on theories that had no connection to reality. Some bled patients, believing the disease was an imbalance of the four humors that governed human health. Others recommended purging with laxatives that weakened the dying even further. A few applied crushed emeralds to the buboes, believing precious stones could draw out the poison. The most desperate donned terrifying leather outfits with long beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, a primitive hazmat suit that offered only the illusion of protection. They died anyway, their bodies found in the streets they had tried to heal. This is where our story truly begins. In the moment when the old world ended and the new world of survival began, when the comfortable certainties of medieval life crumbled and humanity faced its first great test of endurance, when the choice became simple, adapt or die. But before we learn how to survive, we must understand what we're surviving. The enemy was not just disease, it was the collapse of everything that made life worth living. It was the death of trust, the murder of hope, the funeral of civilization itself. The plague had arrived, and it was hungry. Part 2. The Black Arrival. By the time the world realized death was spreading, it had already passed beneath every door, crept through every crack, settled into every corner where humans gathered. The ships that fled the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346 did not arrive in Italy bearing just survivors. They arrived as harbingers of the apocalypse, their hulls filled with more than trade goods and treasure. They carried extinction itself, and as they docked in the ancient port of Messina, their passengers sick and swollen with mysterious ailments, the people came to gawk, unaware they were witnessing the first blow of a plague that would consume an entire continent. It began quietly, as catastrophes often do. The dockworkers noticed a foul smell aboard the ships, something beyond the usual odors of salt and tar and unwashed bodies. It was sweeter, sickening, the smell of meat left too long in the sun. The sailors stumbled out onto the gangplanks, clutching their sides, their skin pale and blistered, their eyes wide with a terror they couldn't name. Some had already died on board, their bodies stiff in the Mediterranean sun, eyes open and glassy, mouths slack with something unspoken, something that looked almost like surprise. The living sailors spoke in fragments, their words broken by fever and delirium. They spoke of storms that weren't storms, of darkness that fell in daylight, of dreams where the dead walked among them. They spoke of Kaffa, of siege engines hurling corpses, of rats that seemed to multiply in the darkness. But their words made no sense to the listeners, who assumed the men were simply mad from their ordeal. Still, no one knew what it meant. The port authorities, concerned about the strange smell and the obvious sickness among the crew, ordered the ships back out to sea, but it was too late. The damage was already done. The rats had already disembarked, scurrying into the maze of warehouses and streets that surrounded the harbor. The fleas had already jumped from their dying hosts to new victims among the curious crowds. Death, now invisible and patient, was walking the cobblestone streets of Messina, touching hands that would never feel warmth again, breathing air that would soon carry screams. From Messina, the plague traveled like spilled ink across a map, following the ancient trade routes that had once brought prosperity to the Mediterranean world. It moved south to Palermo, where the Norman kings had built their palaces in the shadow of ancient temples. It swept east to Naples, where fishermen pulled their nets from waters that would soon be choked with corpses. It spread west to Sardinia and Corsica, remote islands that had thought themselves safe from the troubles of the mainland. The Mediterranean, once called Mare Nostrum by the Romans, became the plague's playground. The disease moved not with the dramatic flourish of conquering armies or the righteous fury of crusaders, but with the quiet persistence of merchants and traders. It traveled in bolts of silk. It hid in sacks of grain that rustled with more than wheat. It nestled in the fur of exotic animals, in the wood of carved ornaments, in the very coins that changed hands in marketplaces across the known world. In just months, it spread across the Italian peninsula and began its inexorable march toward the heart of Europe. Each city it touched became a laboratory of death, a place where the living learned new lessons about suffering and survival. The disease seemed to adapt to each location, finding new ways to spread, new vulnerabilities to exploit. By the time it reached Marseille, the great French port that had welcomed ships from across the Mediterranean for centuries, the dead were no longer buried in individual graves. There were simply too many, too quickly. They were stacked, row upon row, in pits that seemed to grow deeper each day. The gravediggers worked in shifts, their faces covered with cloth soaked in vinegar, their hands blistered from endless shoveling. They soaked the bodies in lye and covered them with lime, trying to mask the smell and prevent the spread of what they still believed was poisoned air. Monks and nuns, once thought immune to illness because of their service to God, began dying in waves that crashed over the monasteries and convents. The same hands that had anointed kings and offered salvation to the masses were now blackened with the rot of plague. The same voices that had sung hymns of praise now gasped for breath that would not come. The same hearts that had beat with divine love now struggled against the poison that coursed through their veins. In Florence, one of Europe's most vibrant cities, a place where art and commerce had created a new kind of civilization, death came on the heels of spring. As the sun warmed the ancient cobblestones and the markets filled with olives and cloth, with wine and laughter, the first reports emerged like whispers in the wind. A merchant collapsed near the Duomo, his body convulsing as he called out to saints who did not answer. A child died mid-play in the piazza, his ball rolling away as his friends watched in horror. A servant began vomiting blood before supper, staining the floors of palaces where princes had walked in safety. And still, no one believed it would last. It was just an illness, they told themselves. Just something going around. Florence had survived wars, floods, famines. It had weathered the storms of politics and the fury of nature. Surely it could survive this as well. The city's physicians, trained in the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome, prescribed their traditional remedies: bloodletting, purging, the balance of humors. The priests offered prayers and penance. The merchants counted their coins and planned for the future. Within weeks, Florence was quiet, not because the people had fled, but because they had died. The streets that had once echoed with the voices of poets and philosophers now carried only the sound of wind through empty windows. The markets that had bustled with activity now stood deserted, their stalls filled with goods that no one would buy, food that no one would eat. The great cathedral that had been the pride of the city now served as a morgue, its sacred spaces filled with bodies that would never see resurrection. And yet, even as entire households vanished overnight, even as the proud families of Florence found themselves reduced to silence and ash, the rest of Europe moved as it always had. The news traveled slowly in those days, carried by messengers who might themselves be dead before they reached their destinations. Each city, each kingdom, each village told itself the same comforting lie. It won't come here. We are different. We are protected. We are chosen. But the plague didn't need an invitation. It didn't respect borders or acknowledge privileges. It crept in through market stalls, hidden beneath bolts of silk and satin. It rode in the breath of a traveling priest who had given last rites to the dying. It nestled in the fur of livestock, being driven to market in the blankets of caravans, carrying goods across the continent. The tighter the walls, the more crowded the cities, the faster it spread. Human contact, the very thing that had made civilization possible, became the instrument of its destruction. In Avignon, where Pope Clement VI had retreated to rule from what he hoped was relative safety, the church itself began to collapse beneath the weight of the dying. So many bodies floated in the Rhine River that men with poles were hired to push them downstream like driftwood, their faces bloated and unrecognizable, their clothes torn away by the current. The survivors drank wine instead of water, believing it might cleanse them of whatever poison filled the air. They burned incense until the smoke made their eyes water. They prayed until their voices gave out. None of it mattered. Entire convents were wiped out in days, their silent corridors filled with the bodies of women who had devoted their lives to God. The nuns who had tended to the sick now needed tending themselves. But there was no one left to care for them. They died alone, their final prayers echoing in empty chambers. Their bodies discovered only when the smell became too strong to ignore. And still, people prayed. They believed God would save them, that the righteous would be spared, that their faith would be rewarded with protection. They formed processions through the streets, carrying crosses and relics, singing hymns that grew weaker with each passing day. As more voices fell silent, they confessed their sins to priests who might be dead before morning. They gave away their possessions to the poor, hoping charity might buy them salvation. They were wrong. The plague took the faithful and the heretic with equal enthusiasm. It consumed the charitable and the selfish, the young and the old, the beautiful and the ugly. It was the most democratic force in human history, the great equalizer that reduced kings and beggars to the same pile of rotting flesh. By the start of 1349, Europe was no longer in denial. It was in collapse. The networks of trade and communication that had connected the continent began to break down. Ships stayed in harbor, their crews too afraid to sail. Caravans turned back rather than risk the roads. Markets closed, not because there were no goods to sell, but because there were no people left to buy them. Fields went unplowed as farmers died in their cottages. Crops rotted in the ground while cities starved. Inns closed their doors, their keepers buried in the yards where travelers had once watered their horses. Entire towns were abandoned, their gates swinging open in the wind. Chickens wandering streets where children had once played, where lovers had once met, where life had once seemed eternal. The very concept of the future began to crumble. Why plant crops if you might not live to harvest them? Why build houses if there might be no one left to live in them? Why have children if they would only die in your arms? The plague didn't just kill bodies, it murdered hope itself, leaving the survivors to wander through a world that no longer made sense. If you wanted to survive, you had to make impossible choices. You could run, but that meant risking roads swarming with bandits and the infected, carrying nothing but what you could carry, leaving behind everything that had made life worth living. Or you could hide, barricading yourself behind walls and doors. But that meant starvation, loneliness, and the slow madness that comes from watching the world die through a crack in the shutters. The idea of community, the bonds that had held civilization together, began to unravel. Doors that had once opened freely for neighbors now stayed bolted day and night. Priests gave confession from behind barriers, afraid to touch the hands that sought absolution. Some villages sealed themselves entirely, posting guards at their gates, sending out only a single person to gather news and supplies. If that person didn't return, no one followed. The village simply waited, counting the days, praying that isolation would be enough. But isolation was never enough. The plague found ways. It traveled on the wind, in the water, in the very air that people breathed. It rode with merchants who seemed healthy, with children who showed no symptoms, with animals that carried death in their blood. You could build walls 10 feet thick, and it would find a crack. You could hide in the deepest cellar, and it would seep through the stones. And yet, even as the horror spread, even as the familiar world collapsed into chaos, the living adapted. They learned new skills, new fears, new ways of thinking about survival. Farmers buried their own dead rather than wait for priests who might never come. Fathers dug graves for their sons with hands that shook from more than grief. Children were left crying beside the bodies of their mothers, forced to grow up in a world where childhood was a luxury no one could afford. The gravediggers, those who were brave enough or desperate enough to handle the endless stream of corpses, became the aristocracy of the new world. They wore masks soaked in vinegar, stuffed their mouths with cloves, and convinced themselves that they were immune to the fate that had claimed so many others. Some grew rich from their terrible work, charging gold for what had once been an act of charity. Others went mad, their minds breaking under the weight of endless death. Everyone had a remedy, a theory, a prayer that might save them. No one had a cure. The plague moved like a living thing, adapting, evolving, finding new ways to spread terror and death. It came in the night when people thought they were safe. It came at weddings when families gathered to celebrate. It came in the silence between church bells that no longer rang because there was no one left to ring them. But the plague was not just a disease, it was a revelation. It stripped away the pretenses of civilization and revealed what lay beneath: animals desperate to survive, capable of both incredible cruelty and unexpected compassion. It showed that the social order was as fragile as human flesh, that the kings and priests and merchants were no different from the farmers and beggars when death came calling. And as it arrived in each new city, each new kingdom, each new village, a question began to form in the minds of those who remained. How do you survive when the world itself is dying? How do you hold on to your humanity when humanity itself seems to be ending? The answer, as we shall see, was more complicated and more terrible than anyone could have imagined. Part 3. Death in the streets. The cities didn't fall all at once. They decayed slowly, methodically, like fruit left in the sun too long, like corpses rotting from the inside out. You could measure the progress of the plague not by the calendar or the position of the sun, but by the change in sound. A bustling market became hushed prayers. Hushed prayers became screams. Screams faded into the buzz of flies, the rustle of wind through empty windows, the soft thud of bodies hitting the ground. In 1349, to walk the streets of a major city like Florence, Paris, or London was to walk through a theater of death, a stage where the final act of civilization played out in real time. The bodies didn't hide in discreet graves or proper coffins. They spilled from windows where they had been thrown by relatives too weak to carry them downstairs. They were dragged into carts like sacks of grain, their limbs scraping against stone, their jaws hanging open in silent screams, their eyes staring at a sky that seemed to have forgotten them. The air itself had changed. Once, it had carried the sense of bread baking, of flowers blooming in gardens, of wood smoke from comfortable hearths. Now it was thick with rot, acrid with the smoke of burning herbs, rank with human waste from houses where the living no longer had the strength to care for basic hygiene. People covered their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar or rosewater, believing it would protect them from the poisoned air. They pressed flowers to their noses, burned incense in their homes, scattered herbs in their path. It didn't matter. The plague didn't travel through cloth or flowers or prayers. The plague traveled through touch, through breath, through the invisible connections that bound human lives together. Every handshake was a potential death sentence. Every kiss might be a final farewell. Every shared meal could be the last supper for everyone at the table. Children wandered the streets alone, their voices cracked from calling out for mothers who were already dead, for fathers who had fled in terror, for siblings who lay rotting in houses that no one dared to enter. They survived by begging, by stealing, by eating scraps thrown from windows, by survivors who were too afraid to open their doors. Some were taken in by strangers who needed their small hands for tasks that adults could no longer perform. Others simply disappeared, becoming part of the nameless dead who littered the alleys and squares. Dogs licked blood from doorsteps, their masters too sick to feed them, too weak to drive them away. Cats vanished almost entirely, killed by superstitious people who believed they spread the disease, or simply succumbing to the same mysterious illness that claimed everything else. Even rats began to die in massive numbers, their bodies piling up in corners and gutters, though by then it no longer mattered. The fleas had found better hosts. The disease had learned to travel from human to human without its original carriers. Some tried to continue their work, to maintain the rhythms of normal life in the face of abnormal death. Bakers still baked bread, standing before ovens that seemed to glow like the fires of hell, kneading dough with hands that shook from fever. They worked until they collapsed, their bodies falling into the very flames they had tended, their shops filling with smoke that carried the scent of burning flesh. Priests still prayed, their voices echoing in empty churches, conducting mass for congregations of corpses, offering communion to the dying who could no longer swallow. Barbers who had once trimmed beards and cut hair now cut away infected flesh, hoping that cutting deep enough, burning fast enough, might spare the rest of the body. They heated knives in flames and pressed them against buboes that swelled like black fruits. They drained pus from wounds that seemed to have no bottom. They applied poultices made from anything they could find: onions, garlic, butter, even crushed glass. The patients screamed and died anyway, their bodies twitching as they bled out on tables that were never cleaned, in rooms that reeked of blood and desperation. But nothing worked, nothing helped, nothing mattered. The signs were unmistakable. once you learned to recognize them. First came the fever, striking like a lightning bolt, turning healthy people into babbling, sweating wrecks in a matter of hours. Then came the swellings, the buboes that gave the plague its name. They appeared in the groin, the armpits, the neck, anywhere that lymph nodes clustered beneath the skin. They grew rapidly, sometimes to the size of eggs, sometimes larger, turning black as they filled with infected blood and pus. Then came the vomiting, violent and uncontrollable, bringing up blood and bile and things that had no name. The victims writhed on their beds, their bodies contorting in ways that seemed to defy the laws of anatomy. They spoke in tongues, called out to saints and demons, begged for mercy from gods who had apparently stopped listening. In many cases, dark spots appeared on the skin, spreading like ink stains, turning the living into walking corpses before death finally claimed them. Some bodies bled from the eyes, tears of blood that stained their cheeks like war paint. Others screamed until their throats tore open, their voices joining the constant wail that rose from every infected city. The lucky ones died quickly, their hearts simply stopping from the shock of the infection. The unlucky ones lingered for days, their families watching helplessly as they transformed into something that was no longer quite human. And still, no one really knew what caused it. Theories multiplied like the disease itself. Some said it was miasma, bad air created by the alignment of the planets. Others blamed earthquakes that had released poisonous vapors from the Earth's core. Many pointed to divine wrath, claiming that God was punishing humanity for its sins. The more superstitious blamed witches, Jews, lepers, foreigners, anyone who was different enough to serve as a scapegoat. Doctors carried canes not just to point at symptoms, but to prod the infected from a distance, to lift clothing and examine wounds without actually touching the patient. They wrote notes filled with elaborate theories about the balance of humors, the influence of the stars, the proper application of bloodletting. Their treatments were often worse than the disease itself, bleeding patients who were already weak, purging them with powerful laxatives, forcing them to swallow concoctions made from mercury, sulfur, and ground pearls. It didn't matter. Within days, the doctors too were dead, their bodies found in the streets they had tried to heal, their leather bags scattered with useless instruments and meaningless notes. Some had tried to treat themselves with their own remedies, bleeding themselves to death in rooms filled with the smell of failure and fear. The worst part was how quickly it became normal. People adjusted to corpses like they adjusted to the weather. At first, every death was an outrage, a tragedy that demanded attention and ritual. Then it became a sorrow, something to be mourned and remembered. Then it became a statistic, a number to be recorded and reported. Eventually, a body in the road was just something to step over, no more remarkable than a pile of refuse or a puddle of rainwater. The fear that had once paralyzed entire communities began to dull. The horror that had once seemed unbearable settled into a kind of grim acceptance. Life continued for those still clinging to it, but it was a different kind of life, harder, crueler, more desperate. The normal rules of society, the customs and traditions that had governed human behavior for centuries, began to break down. Some embraced sin, believing the world was ending anyway, and that restraint was pointless. They drank wine from sacred chalices, looted the houses of the dead, took what they wanted from shops whose owners had died behind their counters. They laughed at the priests who were too afraid to stop them, mocked the authorities who had fled to the countryside, celebrated their own damnation with a kind of desperate joy. Others turned fanatical, forming roaming bands of flagellants who marched from town to town, barefoot and bloodied, chanting prayers and whipping themselves raw. They believed that pain would atone for humanity's sins, that suffering would convince God to end the plague. They beat themselves with leather whips embedded with metal spikes, their backs crisscrossed with wounds that never healed. They crawled on their knees over broken glass, slept on beds of thorns, ate nothing but bread and water. But the plague lashed harder than any whip, and their blood seemed to attract it rather than repel it. Society fractured along lines that had always existed but had been hidden by the veneer of civilization. Nobles locked themselves in their manors, surrounding themselves with guards and physicians. Convinced that wealth and power would protect them, they sealed their windows, refused visitors, lived on stored food and wine while the world burned around them. But the plague found them anyway, traveling with their servants, their guards, their doctors. It crept through the walls of their castles like water through stone. Cities enacted quarantine laws, but enforcement was impossible when the enforcers were dying faster than they could be replaced. If your neighbor died, you nailed the door shut and moved on. If your servant showed symptoms, you threw them into the street like garbage. If strangers approached your house, you drove them away with weapons. Compassion evaporated like water in the sun, leaving behind only the bitter residue of survival. And yet, miraculous as it seemed, people still tried to help. Some buried the dead, not because they were paid to do it, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. Some risked infection to feed the hungry, to care for orphaned children, to comfort the dying. Midwives still delivered babies into a world too broken to care for them, their hands steady despite the trembling of their hearts. But heroism rarely lasted long in a world where kindness was often rewarded with death. The disease seemed to punish compassion as swiftly as cruelty. The priests who tended to the sick died before the merchants who hoarded grain. The mothers who cared for infected children died before the fathers who abandoned their families. The doctors who tried to heal the sick died before the gravediggers who simply disposed of the bodies. It was as if the plague had a consciousness, a malevolent intelligence that rewarded selfishness and destroyed virtue. In London, the death toll rose so high that coffins became a luxury few could afford. Bodies were stacked in the streets like cordwood, waiting for carts that might never come. Graves couldn't be dug fast enough by the few gravediggers who remained alive. They used fields, abandoned cellars, even ruined churches as makeshift cemeteries. The earth itself seemed to rebel against so much death, refusing to accept the endless stream of corpses that were shoveled into its embrace. Sometimes people were buried alive, mistaken for dead in their plague-induced stupor. The survivors learned to listen for sounds from beneath the soil, the scratch of fingernails against wood, the muffled screams of those who had awakened in their own graves. But even when they heard these sounds, few had the courage to dig, afraid that opening a grave might release more infection into the air. In Paris, the ancient cemeteries overflowed like rivers during a flood. Bones poked through the earth where too many bodies had been buried too close together. The smell rose from the ground itself, as if the very earth was rotting. The priests at Les Innocents, the great cemetery of the poor, refused to accept more burials, claiming there was simply no more room. The king ordered them to dig deeper, to stack the bodies in layers, to find space where none existed. They obeyed because what choice did they have? And still, the bodies came in endless procession. In the countryside, entire villages vanished without explanation. No records remained of their passing. No graves marked their deaths. Travelers passed through and found houses filled with skeletons, still seated at tables, their bony fingers wrapped around cups that held nothing but dust. Children's bones lay curled beside the larger skeletons of their parents. Whole families frozen in their final moments, their stories lost to time and silence. Even nature seemed to turn against the survivors. With fewer hands to work the land, crops failed in fields that had been fertile for centuries. Grain rotted in storage while people starved in the streets. Livestock roamed unattended, their lowing echoing across empty pastures. Wolves returned to towns that had once driven them away, skulking through abandoned streets, their yellow eyes reflecting the light from windows that would never open again. Forests began to creep back toward roads that no longer carried traffic, vines crawling over walls that had once kept the wilderness at bay. The boundary between civilization and wilderness blurred until it disappeared entirely. Cities became jungles where only the most cunning survived. Villages became ghost towns where the wind played through empty houses like an organ in an abandoned church. The careful order that humans had imposed on the natural world collapsed, leaving behind a landscape that belonged neither to the living nor the dead, but to something in between. And yet, somehow, people endured. Not through science or wisdom or divine intervention, but through fear. Fear became the new religion, paranoia the new philosophy. They adapted their behavior in ways that would have seemed insane just years before. Doors were kept shut and barred day and night. Meals were eaten alone, in silence, with weapons close at hand. Entire neighborhoods sealed themselves off from the outside world, posting guards at every entrance, killing strangers on sight. If a family member coughed, they were cast out immediately, left to die in the streets rather than risk infecting the others. If a neighbor showed signs of illness, their house was burned with them inside. If a stranger approached, begging for food or shelter, they were driven away with stones and curses. Trust died before the body did, and suspicion became the only emotion that could guarantee survival. But even isolation was no guarantee of safety. The plague found ways to breach every defense, to slip through every crack in the wall of human determination. A flea in a sack of grain brought from a supposedly clean village, a rat that squeezed through a gap in the foundation, a bird that carried infected parasites from one house to another, a gust of wind that blew contaminated dust through a momentarily opened window. You could build walls 10 feet thick, and the plague would find a crack. You could hide in the deepest cellar, and it would seep through the stones. You could pray to every saint in heaven, and it would take you anyway, your final breath, a curse against the gods who had abandoned you. There was no safe place, no guaranteed refuge, no strategy that offered certain protection. And as the cities emptied, as the dead outnumbered the living by ratios that had no precedent in human history, as the smoke from funeral pyres blackened the skies like a permanent sunset, a new fear settled into the hearts of the survivors. It was worse than the fear of death, worse than the fear of pain. It was the fear that this would never end, that the world had already died, and the survivors were just too stubborn or too stupid to notice. The plague had become more than a disease. It had become the new reality, the new normal, the new way that the world worked. Children who survived grew up thinking that death was the natural state of things, that corpses in the streets were as normal as rain or snow. Adults forgot what life had been like before the plague, their memories blurred by trauma and loss. The old world, with its markets and festivals and celebrations, seemed like a dream, a story told by madmen, a lie invented to make the present seem more terrible than it actually was. That's when the cracks in faith began to split wide open. Because when you realize that neither king nor priest can stop the dying, when you understand that wealth cannot buy safety and power cannot command health, when you see that the righteous die as quickly as the wicked and the innocent suffer as much as the guilty, the very foundations of belief begin to crumble. Who do you turn to when God has turned away? What do you believe when belief itself seems like a luxury you can no longer afford? How do you maintain hope when hope has become indistinguishable from delusion? These were the questions that haunted the survivors as they huddled in their barricaded houses, listening to the wind blow through empty streets, wondering if they were the last people on earth, or if somewhere, somehow, others were asking the same questions. The answers they found would change the world forever. Part 4. The Plague Doctor's Mask. By the time the plague had devoured half the known world, consumed entire bloodlines, and left kingdoms without heirs, there was one figure who became as feared as the illness itself. He walked the streets like death given human form, his footsteps echoing in the silence that had replaced the bustle of normal life. He was draped in black leather that creaked with each movement, his face hidden behind a long, bird-like beak that made him look like some carrion creature escaped from the depths of hell. His hands were covered in waxed gloves that had touched more death than any human should endure. He didn't run from the dying. He walked straight toward them, slowly, deliberately, inevitably, like an angel of death making his appointed rounds. They called him the Plague Doctor, and if you saw him approaching your house, it meant someone inside was already marked for death, or soon would be. But this symbol of medieval medicine, so iconic in our modern imagination, wasn't born from knowledge or science or any real understanding of disease. He was born from terror, from desperation, from a world that had run out of rational solutions and was grasping at anything that might offer the illusion of control. The Plague Doctor was medicine's admission of defeat, dressed up to look like hope. By the mid-14th century, as the Black Death entered its second year of continental destruction, cities across Europe had begun to formalize their response to the catastrophe. Local councils, kings who still lived, and clergy who hadn't yet succumbed hired men to treat, or at least examine, the infected masses. These were not always trained physicians, because trained physicians were dying as fast as anyone else. In fact, many plague doctors were barbers, butchers, or apothecaries who had experience with blood and sharp instruments, but little understanding of disease itself. What mattered was not their skill or knowledge. What mattered was that they were willing to do the job that no sane person would accept. It was a death sentence, disguised as employment, paid for in gold that might never be spent, by authorities who might not live to see the work completed. To face the plague meant constant exposure to the most virulent disease in human history, the cough that could kill with a single breath, the stench that seemed to cling to everything it touched, the sight of bodies transforming into something that no longer looked human. This was their daily office, their routine, their normal working environment. And so, Out of necessity and superstition, a costume was born. It wasn't armor in any real sense, but it tried to be, creating a barrier between the doctor and the death that surrounded him. The full-length gown was made of heavy cloth, coated in wax or suet to repel what they believed was the miasma, the poisonous air that carried disease. It covered the doctor from neck to ankle, leaving no exposed skin that might absorb the corruption. The gloves and boots were also waxed, treated with substances that were supposed to prevent contamination. A long wooden cane became standard equipment, not for walking, but for prodding patients and lifting blankets without direct contact, for pointing at symptoms from a safe distance, for maintaining the space between life and death. And then there was the mask, that infamous, terrifying mask that has haunted human nightmares for centuries. It covered the entire head like a leather skull, white or black, depending on the city and the doctor's preference. 2 glass-covered eye holes allowed limited vision, but they also created a barrier between the doctor's eyes and the horrors he witnessed daily. The glass was often tinted or treated with substances that were supposed to filter harmful vapors, though in reality they only made the world look stranger, more alien, more like the realm of the dead. But most haunting of all was the beak. Long and curved, like that of a carrion bird, it extended 6 inches or more from the face, creating a grotesque parody of human features. Inside, it was stuffed with herbs and flowers, substances that were supposed to purify the air before it reached the doctor's lungs. Lavender for its clean scent, rose petals for their association with life and beauty, mint to clear the head, cloves for their preservative properties, camphor for its sharp, medicinal smell. The idea was simple and completely wrong. If the plague came from foul smells, from corrupted air, then the doctor would surround himself with pleasant ones. Sweetness would keep death at bay. It didn't. The plague moved through bacteria and fleas, not through bad air or foul odors. But the doctors didn't know that. No one knew that. They were fighting an invisible enemy with visible defenses, trying to stop a microscopic killer with leather and herbs and desperate hope. The outfit became common in cities across Europe as the plague spread and governments attempted to maintain some semblance of medical care. Paris, Venice, Rome, London, they all had their plague doctors walking the streets like leather-clad specters. The sight terrified people, not just because of how the doctors looked, but because of what their presence meant. If you saw that mask at your door, you knew someone in your house was dying. If you saw it in your neighborhood, you knew death had come to visit and might decide to stay. Children cried when they saw the plague doctors coming. Some threw stones, as if violence could drive away what the costume represented. Others simply ran, their small feet pattering against cobblestones as they fled from the bird-faced harbinger of doom. But most people just stood and stared, frozen by a fear so deep it paralyzed the body, even as the mind screamed warnings to flee. Because the man in the mask never brought healing, he brought confirmation that the end was near, that the struggle was almost over, that the only question left was how much pain would come before the final silence. Still, the doctors tried. With tools that were useless and knowledge that was wrong, they attempted to fight the unfighting. They bled patients who were already losing blood through internal hemorrhaging. They opened buboes with knives that spread infection rather than curing it. They drained pus from wounds that seemed to have no bottom, creating new paths for the disease to spread through the body. They applied poultices made from every substance they could imagine, onions to draw out the poison, butter to soothe the inflammation. Even dried toads that were supposed to absorb the corruption through some mystical process. Some swore by astrology, checking the positions of the planets before beginning treatment, believing that the stars determined which remedies would work and which would fail. Others relied on the ancient theory of humors, trying to balance blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile in bodies that were already beyond balancing. One doctor in Rome recommended drinking molten gold, claiming that the pure metal would burn away the infection. Another prescribed eating crushed pearls mixed with wine, as if beauty and luxury could somehow overwhelm disease and death. It always ended the same way. The patient died, usually in agony, often made worse by the treatments they received. And then, within days or weeks, the doctor died too, his protective costume no match for the enemy he faced daily. The leather cracked, the wax wore away, the herbs lost their scent, and death found its way inside anyway. But as the body count grew and the horror deepened, the treatments became more desperate, more experimental, more divorced from any rational understanding of medicine. In some cities, doctors advised locking entire families in their homes and burning the buildings with everyone inside, claiming this was the only way to stop the spread. Others recommended purging entire towns of animals, killing every cat, dog, and pig in the hope that eliminating potential carriers would somehow stem the tide of death. Thousands of animals were slaughtered in these purges, their bodies added to the pyres that already burned day and night. Ironically, the cats that were killed might have helped by keeping rat populations in check. But logic had become another casualty of the plague. Fear drove decisions, not reason, and fear always chose the most dramatic, most visible response, regardless of its effectiveness. The plague doctors weren't just medics attempting to heal the sick. They were also record keepers, bureaucrats of death, whose job was to track the progress of the epidemic. Many were required by law to document every case they encountered, noting symptoms, tracking the spread from house to house, reporting patterns to authorities who might already be dead. These reports helped cities understand how the plague moved through populations, but the knowledge came too late. By the time the data was compiled and analyzed, another 10,000 corpses had joined the count. The doctors' notebooks became catalogs of horror, filled with descriptions that would have been unbelievable if they hadn't been written by eyewitnesses. Pages upon pages describing the progression of symptoms, the speed of death, the way entire families could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. They wrote about children who died in their mother's arms, about priests who collapsed while giving last rites, about their own growing certainty that nothing they did mattered, that they were witnesses to the end of the world. Some doctors abandoned their posts when the futility became too much to bear. They shed their leather costumes, threw away their useless instruments, and joined the streams of refugees fleeing infected cities. Others stayed out of grim duty, continuing to make their rounds, even when they knew they were accomplishing nothing. A few maintained hope that they might find a cure, that their next patient might respond to treatment, that their next remedy might actually work. They were wrong, but their persistence in the face of hopelessness became a kind of heroism, even if it was ultimately meaningless. The tools of medieval medicine, the leech, the knife, the flame, were utterly useless against a microscopic enemy that the doctors couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't even properly name. They were fighting bacteria with superstition, battling evolution with astrology, trying to cure genetic adaptation with herbs and bloodletting. Behind the mask, beneath the leather and wax and desperate hopes, they were just men. Frightened men who sweated in their protective costumes, who jumped at sudden sounds, who prayed to gods who seemed to have stopped listening. They heard the muffled gasps of the dying through the glass eye holes of their masks. They smelled death through the herbs that filled their beaks. They felt their own hearts racing as they examined patients who looked more like demons than human beings. The psychological toll was enormous. Many plague doctors reported nightmares, visions of endless parades of corpses, dreams where they themselves died over and over in different ways. Some began to believe they were already dead, that their work in the realm of the dying had somehow transported them to hell. Others developed a kind of emotional numbness, a protective callousness that allowed them to function, but made them seem as inhuman as the disease they fought. It wasn't only doctors who suffered these psychological wounds. Surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, anyone whose work brought them into contact with the infected experienced the same gradual erosion of hope and sanity. Gravediggers worked until their hands bled and their backs broke from endless digging. Some tried wearing vinegar-soaked clothes, believing the sharp smell would protect them. Others covered themselves in animal fat, hoping to create a barrier that death couldn't penetrate. One gravedigger in Avignon reportedly wore the same shirt for 3 months straight, convinced that changing clothes would somehow let death inside his protective ritual. Another insisted on being paid in blessed coins, as if holy currency could purchase safety from divine wrath. They developed elaborate superstitions, complex rituals, desperate beliefs that gave them the illusion of control in a world that had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to manage. But the mask persisted long after its practical purpose had been proven useless. Over time, it became more than a uniform or a piece of medical equipment. It became a symbol, a warning, a curse made visible. Children in Florence whispered that if you saw the beaked man in your dreams, your family would die by dawn. In Paris, rumors spread that plague doctors weren't healing the sick at all, but harvesting souls for the devil, that their bird-like beaks weren't filled with herbs, but with the screams of the damned. The mask appeared in paintings as a symbol of death itself. Artists drew it, hovering over battlefields, standing in empty churches, walking through abandoned cities. It became associated not with healing, but with ending, not with hope, but with the final surrender to forces beyond human comprehension or control. And still, desperate cities kept hiring plague doctors, kept sending them into infected houses, kept hoping that somehow their presence would make a difference. Because what choice did they have? The plague overwhelmed everything else, laughed at kings and saints, chewed through cities, and spat out bones. The doctors in their bird-beaked masks were just another symptom of civilization's collapse. Visible proof that medicine had failed, that knowledge had limits, that human ingenuity could be utterly defeated by forces it couldn't understand. By 1350, the mask had become a symbol of helplessness disguised as expertise, of ignorance dressed up as wisdom, of the terrible moment when humanity realized it had no answers to the questions that mattered most. And yet, it survived in human memory long after the Black Death had passed, becoming one of the most recognizable images in European culture. Even now, centuries later, it stirs something primal in the human psyche. The bird-beaked face that seems to stare into your soul, the cold, glassy eyes that reflect your own mortality. The silent figure walking calmly through chaos and screams, untouched by the emotions that destroy lesser mortals. He does not speak words of comfort. He does not offer hope or healing. He only watches, records, and waits. And when his work is finished, when the last patient has died and the last house has been marked, he moves on to the next city, the next epidemic, the next opportunity to witness the end of everything. But the plague wasn't finished with Europe yet. It had one more lesson to teach, one more foundation of medieval life to destroy. Because when the prayers stopped working and the priests started dying faster than their congregations, when the very representatives of God on earth proved as mortal as the sinners they claimed to save, faith itself began to crack and crumble. What happens when people stop believing in salvation? When they realize that divine protection is a lie, that righteousness offers no shield against suffering, that the church has no special connection to heaven? The answer would reshape European civilization in ways that the plague itself could never have managed alone. Part 5: Quarantine and Chaos. The first quarantine wasn't born from science. It was born from desperation. In the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, they made a decision that would outlive the dead. No ship could dock unless it remained anchored offshore for 30 days. 30 giorni, later extended to 40. 40 giorni, quarantine. They didn't understand disease, but they understood patterns. Ships that came from certain ports brought death with them. So they waited. And sometimes it worked. The harbor master of Ragusa kept meticulous records, scratched into parchment with ink made from charcoal and tree sap. Ship after ship arrived from Constantinople, from Kaffa, from ports already touched by the darkness. The captain would cry out from the deck, pleading to dock, to unload cargo, to let his men touch solid ground, but the harbor master held firm. 30 days became the rule, then 40. The mathematics of survival written in waiting. On those quarantined ships, time moved like molasses. Sailors ate through their supplies while watching the city walls from afar. Some ships never made it past the waiting period. The crew would sicken and die while anchored just beyond salvation. Other vessels would float empty by the time the 40 days passed, their crews having succumbed to the plague, or, in some cases, having thrown themselves overboard rather than face the slow rot of disease. The city watched these floating tombs with a mixture of relief and horror. Children would gather at the harbor walls, counting the days, placing bets on which ships would survive the quarantine. Merchants calculated losses, while priests offered prayers for the souls trapped between sea and shore. It was a cruel mathematics, but it was mathematics that kept Ragusa alive while other cities burned. But outside that isolated miracle, the rest of Europe descended into madness. Cities tried to mimic Ragusa's policy, but most lacked the discipline, the resources, or the geographic advantages of an island fortress. Some built walls, hastily constructed barriers of stone and timber that rose overnight around market squares and residential districts. Others set guards at their gates, armed men who turned away travelers with the point of a sword or the threat of an arrow. The lucky were simply refused entry. The unlucky were executed on sight for the crime of seeking shelter. In Florence, the city council issued edicts daily, each more desperate than the last. First, they banned travelers from the south, then from the east, then from anywhere beyond the city walls. They demanded health certificates, signed by priests and stamped with official seals. stating that the bearer came from a plague-free parish. But those parishes were already burned to the ground, their priests dead, their records scattered like ash in the wind. The certificates became a black market commodity. Forgers worked by candlelight, copying the signatures of dead clerics, inventing parishes that had never existed. A scrap of parchment with the right marks could mean the difference between entry and execution. Some travelers carried dozens of different certificates, papers for every possible destination, each one a lie, dressed in official language. And still, the rats came, and the fleas, and the silence that followed. The plague didn't respect walls or guards or certificates. It climbed ropes like a sailor, crossed moats like a merchant, sailed on the wind like a prayer. It hid in grain sacks and clothing bales, in the fur of cats and the hair of children. It traveled in the breath of the healthy and the touch of the kind. In larger cities like Milan, quarantine turned brutal. The authorities, faced with the impossible task of containing an invisible enemy, chose the path of absolute control. Entire households were sealed inside at the first sign of illness. Not just the sick, but everyone who had shared their air, their food, their space. The doors were bricked shut with mortar mixed from sand and desperation. Windows were boarded with planks nailed from the outside. No exceptions, no exits, no mercy. If you were healthy when the first cough began, you wouldn't be by the end. The authorities called it containment. The victims called it burial. Families would pound on the walls until their fists bled, screaming to be released, promising they were well, begging for just one breath of free air. But the guards outside had orders, and fear made those orders absolute. Inside those sealed houses, horror compounded. The healthy watched the sick deteriorate, knowing their own fate was written in every labored breath. Children died in their mother's arms. Husbands held vigil over wives who no longer recognized their faces. Food ran out. Water ran out. Hope ran out. By the time the 40-day quarantine period ended and the doors were unsealed, the houses had become tombs. The living had become the dead. Some families, sensing the approaching doom, would try to break free before the authorities arrived. They would climb through sewers, lower children through wells, or simply rush the guards in desperate charges that usually ended in blood. A few succeeded in escaping, but they carried the plague with them to new districts, new families, new tragedies. But the worst of it was the unpredictability. Plague logic defied human understanding. One house might escape untouched, while the next lost every soul. A single servant could carry death from one mansion to an entire district, moving through the social hierarchy like death made democratic. Merchants opened crates of cloth and died days later, the bolts crawling with unseen killers that had traveled thousands of miles to find them. The wealthy tried to buy their way out of contagion. They hired food tasters, not for poison, but for plague. They paid servants to handle all goods, all letters, all contact with the outside world. Some noble families built elaborate chambers within their homes, sealed rooms with their own air supply, their own food stores, their own waste systems. They would retreat into these chambers at the first rumor of plague and emerge only when the danger had passed. Some never emerged at all. Markets shuttered, schools closed, courts dissolved. Cities became mazes of boarded windows and padlocked doors. The normal rhythms of urban life stopped. Streets that had once echoed with the calls of vendors and the laughter of children now held only the sound of wind through abandoned buildings and the occasional cry of pain from behind sealed doors. Fires burned constantly throughout the cities. Bodies, furniture, clothing, anything that might carry the plague. The authorities ordered these fires lit at dawn and kept burning until dusk. The smoke rose in columns that could be seen for miles, a signal to travelers that death ruled here. The air stank of smoke, rot, and panic. People covered their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar or wine, trying to filter out the smell of their dying world. In Paris, the government fled. The royal court abandoned the city, taking with them the apparatus of rule and leaving behind only chaos. Nobles packed their carriages in the dead of night and rode for distant castles, their guards clearing the roads of anyone who might slow their escape. The common people, left behind, watched their rulers disappear into the darkness and understood that they were truly alone. In London, royal edicts banned gatherings and ordered infected homes marked with red paint. Great red crosses appeared on doors throughout the city, accompanied by the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." The crosses became symbols of shame and terror. Neighbors would avoid entire streets marked with red. Children would dare each other to touch the painted doors, then run away screaming. Some families would scrape off the paint in the night, only to have it reapplied by dawn. In Venice, patrol boats circled the canals, ensuring no one entered or left without inspection. The city's network of waterways, usually its greatest strength, became a maze of checkpoints and barriers. Gondoliers were pressed into service as guards, their knowledge of the city's hidden passages making them invaluable for enforcement. But the plague ignored it all. It climbed ropes, crossed moats, sailed on the wind. Some cities turned inward, enforcing their own strange rules, born from desperation and superstition. In Cologne, bell ringers were forbidden from tolling for the dead. The constant ringing had begun to drive people mad, a soundtrack of doom that never ended. Instead, the dead were buried in silence, their passing marked only by the grief of those left behind. In Siena, officials demanded the dead be buried before sundown. They believed that corpses left overnight would contaminate the air, spreading poison to the living. But there weren't enough gravediggers, and by dusk, the corpses outnumbered the living 10 to 1. Families began burying their own dead in gardens, in courtyards, anywhere they could dig. The city became a vast cemetery, with the living walking among countless unmarked graves. And where laws failed, mobs took over. Blame became currency in the economy of fear. Foreigners were hunted through streets like animals. Jews, lepers, and outsiders became scapegoats for a disaster that no human hand had caused. In Strasbourg, thousands of Jews were burned alive in a public square, not for proof of wrongdoing, there was none, but because fear is a loud, contagious thing, and once it spreads, it doesn't care about facts, only blood. The mob mentality fed on itself, growing stronger with each act of violence. A rumor that Jews had poisoned wells would spread faster than the plague itself. Entire communities would be massacred based on nothing more than whispered accusations and the need to blame someone, anyone, for the unbearable suffering. Some towns turned into fortresses, others fell into anarchy. In isolated regions, bands of survivors declared themselves rulers, enforcing curfews with sword and fire. Traveling monks warned of cities ruled by children, their parents dead, their innocence replaced by the hard calculus of survival. They spoke of towns where no adults were left, where 12-year-olds made decisions of life and death. The line between myth and history blurred. In the countryside, things were no better, with so many dead harvests failed. Grain rotted in the fields under the summer sun, while those who might have gathered it lay buried beneath the earth they had once worked. Livestock starved in abandoned pens, their lowing a mournful chorus that echoed across empty valleys. Famine followed plague like a twin shadow, stalking those who had survived the first disaster only to face the second. Starving families boiled leather and tree bark, grinding acorns into flour, eating grass like cattle. Some turned to cannibalism, desperate parents making choices that would have been unthinkable in better times. Others simply laid down beside the dead and waited their turn, too weak to fight, too broken to hope. And yet, the world didn't stop. Caravans still moved, guarded by mercenaries who charged premium rates for traveling through the lands of the dead. Blacksmiths still forged tools and weapons, their fires a beacon of industry in a world going dark. Some taverns reopened, their doors smeared with garlic and ash, their proprietors desperate for customers and income. People whispered about immunity, about survivors who had gotten sick and recovered. They followed them, paid them, worshipped them, but most just hid. Quarantine bred isolation, and isolation bred madness. In one town, a man nailed his windows shut and refused to speak for 100 days. His neighbors left food at his door and heard him moving inside, but never saw his face or heard his voice. When he finally emerged, his hair had gone white, and his eyes had the distant look of someone who had seen too much. In another, a woman gave birth alone and lived in silence with her baby for a year before emerging, hair white, eyes wild, speaking only in hymns. She had created her own religion during the isolation, her own explanations for the world's cruelty. The child, when found, could not speak at all, having heard only songs and prayers for the first year of life. And through it all, the plague came in waves. It would vanish for weeks, then return with a new fury. Towns declared themselves saved, only to fall again days later. The sick recovered, then relapsed. The dead were buried, then dug up and burned when the smell overwhelmed the earth. No one trusted survival. It felt like a trick, a temporary reprieve before the final blow. The cities that once pulsed with life now beat slowly, erratically, like a heart struggling to keep rhythm. Law meant little, faith meant less. Everyone was waiting for someone else to fix it. God, the king, the priests, but no one came. No one could. The authorities had fled or died. The church was empty. The crown was powerless against an enemy that couldn't be fought with swords or treaties. And then came the fanatics. Because when chaos becomes normal, something worse always follows. That's where we're going next. Part 6, Faith, Fire, and Fanaticism. When the plague first came, people turned to faith with the desperation of drowning swimmers reaching for driftwood. They packed into churches until the stone walls could barely contain the mass of humanity pressing forward, seeking salvation. They knelt beneath painted ceilings that depicted heaven and hell, their prayers rising like smoke to mingle with the incense that burned constantly, day and night. They whispered desperate pleas to saints whose names they had learned only in childhood, half-remembered syllables that might carry their souls to safety. The churches became refuges, not just for the spirit, but for the body. Families crowded into naves and chapels, sleeping on stone floors, sharing what little food they had, believing that sacred ground might offer protection from sacred judgment. Children were baptized daily, their parents convinced that original sin might be the doorway through which death entered. Confession lines stretched around entire city blocks, penitents waiting hours to whisper their sins to priests who had heard the same catalog of human weakness countless times. They lit candles until the wax overflowed onto stone floors, creating pools of hardened devotion that pilgrims would later kneel upon, grinding their knees into the remnants of others' prayers. The light from thousands of candles turned cathedral interiors into galaxies of flickering hope, each flame a life still burning, still hoping, still believing that God was listening. They wept before crucifixes carved from wood brought from the Holy Land, kissed relics that had supposedly touched the bodies of saints, and promised lives of piety in exchange for one more breath. Mothers held dying children up to painted Madonnas, begging the Virgin for mercy, for intervention, for the kind of miracle that had once turned water into wine and brought the dead back to life. And the Church answered at first. It offered processions that wound through city streets like rivers of faith, thousands of believers following priests who carried golden reliquaries and silver crosses through the plague-darkened world. The processions would begin at dawn, voices raised in Latin hymns that echoed off stone buildings, and continue until dusk, a moving prayer that sought to sanctify the very air through which it passed. Bishops offered blessings to anyone who asked, their hands moving in the sign of the cross so many times each day that the gesture became automatic, unconscious. They sold indulgences at cutthroat prices, promising years off purgatory for coins that would have once bought a horse. The logic was simple. If the end times were coming, then salvation was the only currency that mattered. Priests walked among the dying, holding aloft gilded relics that caught what little light filtered through shuttered windows. They swung censers heavy with incense, filling sick rooms with smoke that was supposed to purify the air, but only made breathing more difficult for those already struggling for breath. They administered last rites to dozens each day, their oil supplies dwindling as fast as the lives they were meant to sanctify. They preached that the plague was a punishment for sin, a divine correction for a world that had grown too comfortable with luxury, too accepting of vice, too distant from the love of God, that humanity had grown weary of lust, greed, vanity, and the 7 deadly sins that medieval theology had cataloged so carefully, that repentance would bring salvation, that confession would bring healing, that faith would bring deliverance. The sermons grew more fiery as the death toll mounted. Priests who had once spoken of God's love now thundered about divine wrath. They pointed to plagues in the Bible, to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, to the floods that had cleansed the world in Noah's time, that the plague was actually God's gift to a world too sinful to save itself. But then the priests began to die. Not just a few, hundreds, thousands. Entire monasteries emptied like water from a broken jar. Convents collapsed as nuns fell ill and died within their cloistered walls. Bishops, abbots, even cardinals fell ill and withered in their robes, their bodies succumbing to the same forces that claimed peasants and kings alike. The hierarchy that had once seemed divinely protected proved as fragile as any mortal institution. Some were buried without ceremony, their bodies too dangerous to touch, too numerous to handle with the elaborate rituals that their rank would normally demand. Others were left where they fell, their corpses lying on altar steps or in confessionals, too hazardous to move. The living clergy, those few who remained, faced an impossible choice: tend to the dead and risk death themselves, or abandon the bodies and risk the spiritual consequences of leaving God's servants unburied. The monasteries that had once copied manuscripts and preserved knowledge became charnel houses. Libraries filled with centuries of accumulated wisdom stood empty, their scribes dead, their illuminated manuscripts gathering dust. The chain of religious learning that had connected medieval Europe to its classical past began to break, link by link, death by death, and the people began to notice. If God's chosen weren't safe, then who was? If bishops could die like beggars, if abbots could rot like any common sinner, then what did divine favor actually mean? The questions began as whispers in marketplaces, grew into discussions in homes, and eventually became open challenges to religious authority. The great lie began to fray. The church, which had stood like a fortress through war, famine, and revolt, began to crack under the weight of the plague. Its promises of protection proved empty. Its explanations of divine justice proved inadequate. Its leaders proved mortal. And through those cracks, something else slithered in: doubt. It started quietly, a whispered joke about the bishop's corpse rotting in his own cathedral, a merchant who stopped attending Mass, claiming he was too busy with business, but really afraid that crowds bred contagion, a nobleman who hid in his villa, refusing communion because the shared cup might carry death from lips that had already kissed the plague. Then it spread, like the plague, but faster, carried not by fleas or rats, but by the human need to make sense of senseless suffering. People began to ask questions that would have been unthinkable just months before. If God was all-powerful, why didn't he stop the plague? If the church was his representative on earth, why were its servants dying like everyone else? If prayer and penance were supposed to bring salvation, why did the most devout often die first? Some turned inward, seeking mystical experiences that the church couldn't provide or control. They practiced private devotions, invented personal rituals, created their own relationships with the divine that bypassed institutional religion entirely. They spoke of receiving visions, of hearing voices, of experiencing God directly without the mediation of priests or sacraments. Others turned violent, their faith transformed into fury by the church's failure to protect them. They stormed cathedrals, smashed statues, burned religious manuscripts that they blamed for false promises. They attacked priests in the streets, accusing them of fraud, of taking money for blessings that didn't work, of promising miracles that never came, and others turned to the flagellants. They arrived without warning, like a plague of their own design. Hundreds of men, barefoot and shirtless, marching through towns in long, winding processions that stretched for miles. Their backs were bloodied from their own whips, cords studded with iron or bone that they used to flay their own flesh in public displays of penance. They sang hymns between screams, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of their self-inflicted wounds. They chanted Latin verses that most of them didn't understand, words that had been passed down through oral tradition as their movement spread across Europe. Some wore hoods that covered their faces, becoming anonymous vessels for collective guilt. Others wore nothing at all, their nakedness a rejection of worldly vanity, their exposed bodies canvases for the artwork of suffering. They called themselves the Brethren of the Cross, the Brothers of Flagellation, the penitents of the last days. But what they brought was not salvation, it was frenzy. They believed the plague was punishment for humanity's sins, but unlike the church, they offered a solution that didn't depend on priests or sacraments or divine mercy. They could earn forgiveness through their own blood, their own pain, their own willingness to suffer. The mathematics were simple. If sin brought plague, then suffering would bring salvation. If God demanded payment for human wickedness, they would pay in flesh. Their processions were theater and theology combined. They would enter a town at dawn, their whips already bloody from the night before, and begin their performance in the main square. The sound of leather on flesh echoed off stone buildings as they beat themselves raw in front of crowds that gathered like spectators at an execution. Children watched in silence, too young to understand, but old enough to remember. Old women wept, seeing in the flagellant's pain their own suffering made visible. Men joined out of fear or guilt, or both, adding their voices to the chorus of agony. And at first, it worked, sort of. Towns welcomed the flagellants like saints returning from the desert. They were a spectacle, yes, but also a symbol, a sign that someone, at least, was trying to answer God's anger with something more than words. People threw flowers in their path, petals that mixed with the blood to create a carpet of beauty and horror. They offered food, shelter, even money, though the flagellants claimed to have renounced worldly possessions. In some places, the plague subsided shortly after they arrived. Coincidence? Probably. The plague came and went in waves, regardless of human intervention. But belief doesn't care about science, and desperate people will see patterns where none exist. The flagellants took credit for every remission, every recovery, every day that passed without new deaths. They became living proof that humans could influence divine justice through their own actions. Their movement grew. Men left their families to join the processions. Some brought their own whips, fashioned from whatever materials they could find. Others improvised, using belts, chains, even tree branches to flagellate themselves. The processions swelled to thousands, an army of the penitent marching across Europe, leaving trails of blood and hope. Then it turned darker. The flagellants began preaching their own gospel, one that put them at the center of salvation rather than the church. They condemned the clergy as corrupt, lazy, ineffective. They burned indulgences publicly, declaring them worthless pieces of parchment that couldn't buy what only blood could earn. They tore crosses from walls, claiming that the real cross was the one they bore on their own backs through their suffering. Their theology grew more radical. They named enemies, Jews, heretics, lepers, prostitutes, anyone who could be blamed for the plague that their suffering hadn't yet stopped. They declared themselves God's chosen instruments, the only humans worthy to cleanse the earth of sin. Their processions became trials. Their destinations became executions. In one town, they dragged a man from his home and stoned him to death for coughing during their procession. His crime was disturbing their sacred ritual, but his real sin was showing symptoms of the plague that their presence was supposed to prevent. In another, they burned a woman alive because she had red hair and didn't attend their chant. Red hair was the mark of the devil, they claimed, and her absence from their ceremony proved her guilt. The church, alarmed, tried to rein them in. Pope Clement VI condemned them as heretics, dangerous fanatics who threatened both civil order and religious authority. Bishops refused them entry to cathedral cities. Local priests preached against them, calling their movement a perversion of true penance. But by then, the crowds were too large, the fear too deep, the need for someone to blame too strong. The flagellants didn't need permission from the church. They had pain, and pain was louder than God. Their processions became riots. Their prayers became pogroms. Their penance became persecution. The fear that had once clung to the plague now clung to its supposed cause, and the flagellants provided both the explanation and the solution. They identified the guilty and punished them, creating order from chaos by naming enemies and destroying them. In the wake of their processions came fires. Entire Jewish communities were wiped out, not by the plague, but by fire, sword, and mob. Synagogues burned, their ancient scrolls and books becoming ash that mixed with human remains. Men were dragged through the streets and disemboweled, their crime being born into the wrong faith at the wrong time. Women were raped before being drowned, their bodies thrown into wells that were then declared poisoned by their presence. Children were thrown into those same wells, their innocence no protection against the madness that claimed their lives were forfeit for their parents' imagined crimes. In some cities, the entire Jewish population was exterminated in a single week. Thousands of people were murdered based on nothing more than religious difference and the human need to blame someone for unbearable suffering. The massacres were systematic, organized, thorough. They were not random acts of violence, but calculated genocide, carried out with the efficiency of people who believed they were doing God's work. And when the killing was done, the plague still came. That's what broke the spell. Slowly, reluctantly, people began to realize that no amount of screaming, whipping, or burning could stop the disease that had already taken so many lives. The flagellants had promised that their suffering would bring salvation, but salvation never came. They had identified enemies and destroyed them, but the plague didn't care about their enemies. It killed Christians and Jews alike, flagellants and their victims, the pious and the sinful, without distinction. The flagellants began to fade. Their processions grew smaller as members died, deserted, or were arrested by authorities who had finally decided to restore order. In some towns, they were chased out by the same crowds that had once fed them. The terror they had summoned turned on them like a rabid dog turning on its master. Some were lynched by mobs who blamed them for the massacres they had instigated. Others simply disappeared, melting back into the population they had once tried to save. But the damage was done. Faith itself was cracked like a mirror dropped on stone. The church would never recover its former grip on European consciousness. In private, people began questioning not just religious authority, but the existence of God Himself. In public, they still prayed, still attended Mass, still went through the motions of medieval Christianity. But behind every prayer was a whisper of doubt, a sense that perhaps no one was listening, that the universe was empty of divine presence, that humans were alone in a world that cared nothing for their suffering. Some abandoned religion altogether. They turned to alchemy, seeking chemical solutions to biological problems. They studied astrology, believing that the stars might provide explanations that God had not. Some retreated into silence, refusing to speak about faith or salvation or the meaning of suffering. Others made their own rules, creating personal philosophies that could withstand the kind of catastrophe that had shattered traditional belief. Cults rose and fell like mushrooms after rain. Doomsday prophets wandered the ruins of cities, screaming at the sky, declaring the end of the world and the beginning of something new. A few declared themselves the Messiah, claiming to be God's final messenger to a doomed world. They gathered followers, performed miracles, promised salvation that only they could provide. They died just like the rest, their divinity, no protection against the plague that consumed everyone equally. And yet, people still fell in love, still had children, still built homes and planted gardens and told stories. The living still needed bread, still needed warmth, still needed meaning. The human capacity for survival, for adaptation, for finding purpose in the midst of catastrophe proved stronger than any plague. Some found meaning in madness, embracing insanity as the only rational response to an irrational world. Others found it in survival itself, making the simple act of living another day into a form of worship, a tribute to the human spirit that refused to be broken. But the world had changed. The plague had not just killed bodies, it had killed certainties. The medieval synthesis of faith and reason, church and state, divine and human authority lay in ruins. What would rise from those ruins was still unclear, but it would be something new, something that had been tested by fire and found wanting, then rebuilt according to new principles. And next, it would face something even stranger. Hope will go there next. Part 7. The strange gift of survival. Survival during the Black Death was a cruel lottery. A lottery where the rules changed daily and the prizes came wrapped in thorns. Some who fell sick died within days, their bodies twisted and blackened like ancient trees struck by lightning. The plague manifested differently in each victim, as if death itself were experimenting with new forms of artistry. Some developed the classic buboes, swellings in the groin and armpits that grew to the size of apples and turned black with corrupted blood. Others suffered from pneumonic plague, coughing up blood until their lungs filled with their own life force. Still others experienced septicemic plague, their blood poisoning itself from within, turning their skin purple and then black as their circulatory system collapsed. Their final breaths were raspy and wet, the sound of life leaving bodies that could no longer sustain it. Families would gather around deathbeds, holding vigil for hours or days, listening to the death rattle that preceded the final silence. Some died quickly, their suffering measured in hours. Others lingered for weeks, their bodies fighting a battle that medicine couldn't understand and faith couldn't win. But others recovered, sometimes miraculously, sometimes slowly. The recoveries were as mysterious as the deaths. A person might be on the verge of death, surrounded by grieving relatives, only to wake the next morning with clear eyes and renewed strength. The fever would break, the buboes would shrink, the coughing would cease. Within days, they would be walking around, eating normally, showing no signs of the disease that had nearly killed them. These recoveries gave rise to countless theories about divine intervention, about the power of prayer, about miraculous cures. Every recovery was studied, analyzed, attributed to different causes. Some believed that certain prayers were more effective than others. Some thought that particular saints had special power over the plague. Others attributed survival to diet, to bloodletting, to the alignment of stars. And then there were those who never showed a single symptom. People who lived with the sick, who cared for the dying, who handled infected corpses, but never fell ill themselves. They carried the plague within, but showed no sign of its terrible toll. These people were both the curse and the hope of the age, walking contradictions that challenged every theory about how the disease spread and whom it chose to spare. Modern historians call this phenomenon immunity, but in the 14th century, it was something else entirely. A mystery wrapped in flesh and blood, a miracle that walked on two legs, a curse that looked like blessing but carried death to others. The immune became objects of fascination and terror. People would follow them through markets, studying their habits, trying to learn the secret of their protection. Some believed that the immune had made pacts with the devil, trading their souls for earthly survival. Others thought they were blessed by God, chosen to survive so they could minister to the dying or bear witness to divine judgment. But the truth was more complex and more terrifying. The immune could still spread the disease, even though they showed no symptoms. They were walking reservoirs of death, carrying the plague from house to house, from town to town, without knowing it. A healthy-looking merchant could arrive in a city and leave behind dozens of corpses. A seemingly well woman could kiss her children goodnight and wake to find them dead by morning. The lucky ones, those who survived the disease after falling ill, were often shunned, feared, and whispered about like ghosts returning from the grave. They had crossed the boundary between life and death and returned to tell the tale. But their survival marked them as different, dangerous, possibly cursed. Villages barred them at the gates, afraid that they might bring the plague back with them. Families disowned them, convinced that anyone who had survived such an ordeal must have paid a price that made them no longer fully human. Some survivors were accused of witchcraft. If they had survived when so many others died, it must have been through supernatural means. In some places, survival itself became evidence of guilt. Witch hunters would arrive in towns and target anyone who had recovered from the plague, subjecting them to trials, tortures, and executions based on nothing more than their ability to live through what had killed their neighbors. Others were accused of making pacts with the devil. The logic was simple. Since the plague was God's punishment, anyone who escaped it must have chosen the devil's protection instead. Survivors found themselves isolated, not just by grief, but by suspicion. Their communities convinced that their continued existence was somehow blasphemous, because no one understood what made one person survive and another perish. Fear turned into suspicion, and suspicion turned into persecution. The plague had already taken their loved ones. Now it was taking their neighbors' trust as well. But for those who lived, survival came with a price that went beyond social rejection. Many lost their entire families, everyone they had ever loved, everyone who had given their lives meaning. They woke each morning in houses that echoed with silence, surrounded by empty chairs and unused plates, haunted by memories of voices they would never hear again. Children survived to find themselves orphans, wandering through empty houses where their parents' bodies still lay rotting in beds that would never be warm again. Parents survived to bury children. Part 8. Aftermath. A world remade. The Black Death did not just kill people, it shattered the very foundations of medieval Europe like a hammer striking glass, breaking old systems, old hierarchies, and old certainties into fragments that could never be reassembled in quite the same way. When the plague finally passed, leaving behind mass graves and empty houses, what remained was not just a population decimated, but a world fundamentally transformed, rebuilt from the ruins of everything that had come before. The first change was economic, and it was brutal in its efficiency. With roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population dead, buried in unmarked graves, or burned in massive pyres, labor became scarce in a way that no economic theory had ever contemplated. Fields that had once been worked by dozens of hands were now tended by a handful of survivors who had to learn new skills simply to keep themselves alive. Entire villages stood empty, their houses gradually reclaimed by nature as vines grew through broken windows and trees pushed up through abandoned floors. The mathematics of survival created opportunities that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Farmers who had once worked for subsistence wages suddenly found themselves in demand, able to negotiate terms that their grandfathers could never have imagined. They demanded higher wages, better working conditions, even ownership of the land they worked. Lords who had once commanded absolute obedience found themselves dependent on people they had always considered beneath their notice. The peasantry, emboldened by scarcity and necessity, began to test the boundaries of feudal obligation. They demanded payment in coin rather than kind, contracts that specified their rights as well as their duties, freedom to move between employers who competed for their services. The rigid bonds that had tied peasants to the land for generations began to loosen as economic necessity forced social change. Some lords tried to enforce the old feudal rights through violence and intimidation, but the balance of power had shifted in ways that couldn't be restored through force alone. The survivors had seen too much death to be easily cowed by threats, and their labor was too valuable to be wasted on maintaining obsolete social structures. Revolts broke out across Europe as the new economic realities collided with traditional authority. The most famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands of common people marched on London demanding an end to serfdom, fair wages, and political representation. They occupied the Tower of London, executed officials who had oppressed them, and forced the young King Richard II to negotiate with people his ancestors would have dismissed without a second thought. Similar uprisings occurred in France, where peasants burned castles and murdered nobles who tried to maintain pre-plague social arrangements. In Germany, workers' guilds seized control of entire cities, establishing new forms of government based on economic participation rather than inherited privilege. The Flemish weavers organized strikes that brought textile production to a halt until their demands were met. For the first time in European history, common folk realized they had leverage, and they used it with the desperate efficiency of people who had already lost everything that could be taken from them. The Black Death had been a great leveler, killing nobles and peasants alike, and the survivors applied that lesson to the social structures that had previously seemed as permanent as the landscape itself. Landowners, priests, and kings found their power slipping away like water through broken fingers. The feudal pyramid that had organized European society for centuries began to collapse as its foundation. The agricultural labor of bound peasants was undermined by death and economic opportunity. Some adapted by offering better terms to attract workers. Others retreated into fortified compounds, trying to preserve islands of old authority in an ocean of change. The old feudal bonds, based on personal loyalty and inherited obligation, were strained to breaking as survivors learned to think of themselves as individuals with rights and choices, rather than as appendages to the land they worked. The Black Death was not just a biological disaster, it was a social earthquake that shifted the fundamental relationships between classes, between rulers and ruled, between those who owned land and those who worked it. At the same time, cities began to grow in ways that transformed the European landscape. With fewer people needed to work the land, and with agricultural production disrupted by death and abandonment, many survivors sought refuge in towns and trading centers that offered opportunities unavailable in the countryside. Cities that had been half-emptied by the plague began to fill again, but with a different kind of population. These new urban dwellers were not just refugees from rural disaster, but entrepreneurs taking advantage of the opportunities created by social disruption. Guilds expanded to include crafts that had been decimated by the plague, training new artisans to replace those who had died. Merchants found new markets as traditional trade routes were abandoned and new ones opened by changing political and economic circumstances. A new middle class started to emerge, people who had neither noble blood nor vast landholdings, but who possessed skills, knowledge, or resources that made them valuable in the post-plague economy. These were survivors who had learned to read and write out of necessity, craftsmen who had expanded their skills to fill gaps left by dead specialists, traders who had developed new networks to replace those destroyed by the plague. This emerging middle class had different values from both the peasantry they had left behind and the nobility they aspired to join. They valued practical knowledge over inherited wisdom, economic success over bloodline, individual achievement over collective obligation. They were the harbingers of a new Europe that would eventually eclipse the medieval world entirely. The growth of cities also meant the growth of new forms of culture and learning. Universities that had been decimated by the plague began to attract students who came not from noble families but from the new merchant class. These students brought practical concerns and worldly perspectives that challenged the abstract scholasticism that had dominated medieval education. Europe was on the cusp of the Renaissance, and the plague's destruction had paradoxically cleared the way for new ideas, new art, and new science. The old authorities had been weakened or destroyed, creating space for innovation and experimentation. Artists began to paint the world as they saw it, rather than as religious doctrine prescribed. Scientists began to observe natural phenomena rather than relying solely on ancient texts. Philosophers began to question assumptions that had been accepted without examination for centuries. Religion, meanwhile, was irrevocably altered in ways that would reshape European consciousness for generations. The Church had failed its people when they needed it most, and that failure created wounds that would never fully heal. Many lost faith entirely, turning to secular explanations for natural phenomena and human behavior. Others maintained their religious beliefs, but redirected them away from institutional Christianity toward more personal forms of spirituality. Heresies proliferated as people created their own theological explanations for what they had experienced. Some developed apocalyptic beliefs, convinced that the plague was a sign of the approaching end times. Others embraced mystical practices that promised direct experience of the divine without clerical mediation. Still others turned to pre-Christian traditions that offered different ways of understanding suffering and survival. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation were sown in the ashes of the plague, as people learned to question religious authority and seek their own relationships with the divine. The Catholic Church's monopoly on salvation had been broken by its failure to provide protection or explanation during humanity's darkest hour, and that break would eventually grow into the schism that divided European Christianity. But the human toll of transformation was staggering beyond any economic or social accounting. Families had been wiped out completely, their names disappearing from the historical record as if they had never existed. Communities that had existed for centuries were abandoned, their accumulated knowledge and traditions dying with their inhabitants. The continuity that had connected medieval Europe to its past was broken in ways that could never be repaired. Children grew up without grandparents to teach them traditional skills and stories. Crafts that had been passed down through generations disappeared when entire families of artisans died within days of each other. Local dialects vanished when there were no longer enough speakers to maintain them. The cultural diversity that had characterized medieval Europe was flattened by death into a more uniform but impoverished landscape. With so many dead, institutional knowledge disappeared along with the people who had possessed it. Monasteries that had preserved classical texts for centuries were abandoned, their libraries left to decay or be scattered by looters. Guild records that had maintained craft standards were lost when the guilds themselves dissolved. Legal traditions that had governed local communities for generations were forgotten when there was no one left to remember or enforce them. Orphans wandered through empty streets, begging for scraps and shelter from strangers who had their own children to protect. These children grew up feral, learning survival skills, but lacking the cultural education that would have been their birthright in normal times. They formed gangs and alternative families, creating new social structures to replace those that had been destroyed by death. Widows struggled to survive alone in a world that had been organized around family units and male authority. Some succeeded by taking over their dead husbands' businesses or trades, becoming entrepreneurs out of necessity. Others fell into destitution, reduced to begging or prostitution to keep themselves alive. A few found new forms of independence and power, but most faced hardships that their married lives had never prepared them for. Yet, despite all this devastation, the survivors rebuilt with a determination that testified to the resilience of human nature. They planted crops in fields that had been graveyards, constructed houses on land where entire families had died, established new communities in places where old ones had been extinguished. The work of reconstruction was both practical and psychological, an effort to create meaning and continuity in a world that had been shattered by meaningless death. They developed new rituals to commemorate the dead and bind the living together. Memorial services became community events that reinforced social bonds among survivors. New holidays were established to mark survival and recovery. Marriage customs evolved to accommodate the unusual circumstances of post-plague society, where traditional family structures had been disrupted and new forms of kinship had to be invented. The memory of the plague became a dark thread woven through European culture, appearing in art, literature, music, and popular tradition for centuries afterward. The Danse Macabre became a popular artistic motif, showing death as a democratic force that claimed king and peasant alike. Religious art began to emphasize human mortality and the transience of earthly pleasures. Literature explored themes of survival, loss, and the search for meaning in a universe that seemed indifferent to human suffering. But alongside these dark themes came celebrations of life that had a new intensity born from the knowledge of how quickly life could be taken away. Survivors learned to appreciate simple pleasures with an urgency that people who had never faced mass death could barely comprehend. Food tasted better, music sounded sweeter, human companionship felt more precious because all of these things had been threatened with extinction. The Black Death also forced Europe to confront its relationship with disease and death in ways that would have lasting consequences for public health and medical practice. The plague was no longer a distant threat mentioned in historical texts, but a living memory that shaped every decision about community, organization, and individual behavior. New approaches to sanitation and hygiene emerged from the practical experience of survivors who had seen how disease could spread through crowded, dirty conditions. Cities began to regulate waste disposal and water supplies more carefully. Building codes were developed to prevent overcrowding and improve ventilation. Public bathhouses, which had been blamed for spreading disease, were replaced by private facilities that reduced the risk of contagion. The fear of pestilence lingered for centuries, shaping everything from urban planning to international trade. Quarantine procedures that had been invented during the plague became permanent features of European commerce and diplomacy. The isolation of the sick became an accepted public health measure, even when the specific disease being treated was not as dangerous as the plague had been. Medical education began to emphasize practical experience over theoretical knowledge as physicians trained by plague conditions passed their hard-won expertise to new generations of healers. The plague had killed many doctors, but those who survived had learned more about disease and treatment than any previous generation of physicians. Their knowledge formed the foundation for advances in medical understanding that would eventually lead to more effective treatments for epidemic disease. Even today, echoes of the plague remain embedded in European culture and institutions. Our modern ideas about quarantine, sanitation, and epidemiology trace their roots back to those desperate times when survival depended on learning to live with the constant threat of death. The story of survival in the face of overwhelming odds continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental questions about human nature and social organization that are as relevant now as they were in the 14th century. The legal and political changes initiated by the plague had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate post-plague period. The breakdown of feudal authority created precedents for popular participation in government that would eventually contribute to the development of democratic institutions. The economic changes forced by labor scarcity established principles of labor rights and economic negotiation that would influence social development for centuries. But the plague was not just an end to the medieval world. It was a beginning, the violent birth of modern Europe from the corpse of its predecessor, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of capitalism, the development of nation-states, the emergence of individual rights and secular authority all had their roots in the social disruption caused by mass death and the creative responses of survivors who had to rebuild their world from scratch. The survivors of the Black Death created more than just new economic and social arrangements. They created new ways of thinking about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual and community that would define European civilization for centuries to come. They proved that even the worst catastrophe could not completely destroy the human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and hope. Their legacy is not just the specific institutions and practices they created, but the demonstration that human societies are more resilient and adaptable than they appear, that survival is possible even in the face of overwhelming disaster, and that reconstruction can lead to forms of life that are not just different from what came before, but potentially better adapted to future challenges. The Black Death was the end of one world and the beginning of another, a transformation so complete that it took centuries for Europeans to fully understand what they had lost and gained in the process. But for the survivors who lived through that transformation, The most important lesson was simpler: that life continues, that humans adapt, and that meaning can be found even in the midst of the most meaningless suffering. Part 9. The Long Shadow. Legacy of the Plague. The Black Death cast a shadow far longer than the years it ravaged Europe. Its legacy shaped politics, culture, religion, and science in ways that still echo today. To understand how to survive the Black Plague, we must look beyond the deaths and destruction to the world it left behind. For in that transformed landscape lies the true measure of human resilience and the blueprint for survival itself. When the plague finally loosened its grip on Europe in the 1350s, it left behind a continent that was fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The world that emerged from this crucible of death was not merely a scarred version of what came before. It was something entirely new, forged in the fires of catastrophe and shaped by the desperate innovations of those who refused to surrender to oblivion. Politically, the plague accelerated the decline of feudalism with the force of an avalanche. The old order, built on rigid hierarchies and bound labor, crumbled as surely as the bodies in massed graves. Nobles, who had ruled through birthright and brute force, suddenly found their power evaporating like morning mist. Labor became scarce, and with scarcity came power. Peasants, who had once bowed their heads in submission, now stood tall, demanding wages, rights, and respect. The feudal contract, that ancient agreement where serfs traded freedom for protection, dissolved in the face of demographic catastrophe. What good was a lord's protection when the lord himself might be dead by morning? What value did noble blood hold when it could be corrupted by the same pestilence that claimed the lowliest beggar? In England, the labor shortage following the plague led to the Statute of Laborers in 1351, a desperate attempt by the ruling class to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But economic forces, like the plague itself, could not be contained by royal decree. Workers demanded more, and they got it. The rigid social structure that had defined medieval Europe for centuries began to crack and splinter. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was a direct descendant of plague-era social upheaval, when Wat Tyler led his followers to London, demanding an end to serfdom and the establishment of fair wages. He was channeling the revolutionary spirit born in plague pits and empty villages. Though the revolt was crushed, the seeds of change had been planted too deep to uproot entirely. Kings consolidated power as the old nobility weakened, but their reigns were marked by constant unrest and rebellion. The centralized monarchies that emerged were not born from strength, but from the desperate need to maintain order in a world gone mad. Royal power grew not because kings became stronger, but because everything else became weaker. France witnessed similar transformations. The Jacquerie Uprising of 1358 saw French peasants rise against their lords with a fury born of desperation and loss. Though brutally suppressed, it demonstrated that the plague had not merely killed bodies, but had murdered the very concept of unquestioning obedience to authority. The delicate balance of medieval Europe was forever changed, setting the stage for modern nation-states. The plague had done what centuries of warfare and political maneuvering could not. It had broken the back of feudalism and forced the creation of new forms of governance, based not on tradition but on necessity. Culturally, the trauma of the plague infused art, literature, and music with a darkness that would persist for generations. The medieval worldview, once characterized by optimism about divine providence and the natural order, gave way to a more complex, troubled understanding of human existence. The Danse Macabre, the dance of death, became more than a popular motif. It became the defining artistic expression of an age that had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. These haunting images, found in churches, manuscripts, and public spaces across Europe, depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life in a final dance. Kings danced with beggars, bishops with merchants, children with the elderly. Death, the great equalizer, showed no preference for rank or righteousness. But the Danse Macabre was more than memento mori. It was a revolutionary statement about the nature of society itself. In a world where social hierarchy had been justified by divine will, the plague revealed the ultimate democracy of death. If God allowed prince and pauper to die equally, what did that say about the supposed divine right of kings? Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio captured not just the despair of the times, but also its dark humor and surprising humanity. His Decameron, written during the plague years, presented a world where traditional morality was suspended, where survival trumped propriety, and where human nature revealed itself in all its complex glory. The stories told by his characters, fleeing the plague-ridden city for the countryside, reflected a new literary sensibility that was more psychologically complex and morally ambiguous than what had come before. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, though written later, bore the unmistakable influence of plague-era thinking. His pilgrims, representing every level of society, were portrayed with a realism and skepticism that would have been unthinkable in earlier medieval literature. The plague had stripped away illusions about human nature and social order, and literature reflected this new, harder wisdom. Music, too, was transformed. The elaborate polyphony of the pre-plague era gave way to simpler, more direct forms of expression. The Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, became one of the most frequently quoted musical themes in Western composition, its haunting melody serving as a reminder of mortality and judgment. The Church's influence began to wane as people sought new ways to understand their world. If God's representatives on earth could not protect the faithful from pestilence, what authority did they truly possess? This questioning of religious authority would have profound implications for centuries to come. Religiously, the plague was nothing less than a theological earthquake that shattered the foundations of medieval Christianity. The failure of the Church to protect the faithful sowed seeds of skepticism and reform that would eventually bloom into the Protestant Reformation. The plague struck at the very heart of Christian doctrine. If God was all-loving and all-powerful, why did he allow such suffering? If prayer and penance could ensure salvation, why did the most devout die alongside the most sinful? These questions, whispered in plague-ridden cities and shouted by flagellant processions, could not be answered by traditional theology. Mysticism flourished as people sought direct, personal relationships with the divine, bypassing the institutional church entirely. Figures like Meister Eckhart and Johannes Tauler gained followings by preaching that God could be found within the individual soul, not just within the walls of a cathedral. This democratization of spiritual experience was revolutionary in a world where the Church had claimed exclusive access to divine truth. Alternative beliefs proliferated in the chaos. Folk magic, herbalism, and astrological speculation all gained adherents among people desperate for any explanation or solution. The boundaries between Orthodox Christianity and popular superstition blurred as the clergy died alongside their flocks. The flagellant movement represented perhaps the most dramatic religious response to the plague. These penitents, believing that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, engaged in public displays of self-mortification, whipping themselves bloody in town squares across Europe. Though eventually condemned by the Church, the movement demonstrated the depths of spiritual crisis that the plague had created. Anti-Semitic persecution reached new heights as communities sought scapegoats for their suffering. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague deliberately, leading to massacres across Europe. These pogroms revealed the dark side of plague-era spirituality, where fear and desperation could twist religious feeling into murderous hatred. The stage was set for the Reformation, which would challenge the very core of medieval Christianity. When Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he was building on foundations laid by plague-era religious questioning. The authority of the papal church, already weakened by its failure during the Black Death, could not withstand the assault of reformist theology. Medically, the plague spurred the first systematic attempts at public health in European history. Cities experimented with quarantine, isolation, and sanitation measures that, while often crude and misguided, represented humanity's first organized response to epidemic disease. Venice established the first formal quarantine system in 1348, requiring incoming ships to wait 40 days before entering the harbor. The word quarantine itself derives from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. This practice, though based more on biblical precedent than medical understanding, proved effective enough to be adopted across Europe. Milan pioneered perhaps the most draconian but effective response: complete isolation of plague victims. When the first cases appeared in the city, authorities immediately walled up infected houses with their occupants inside, providing food through windows but allowing no contact with the outside world. Though brutally harsh, Milan suffered fewer deaths than most other Italian cities. The concept of contagion, while not fully understood, began to take shape during the plague years. Physicians like Guy de Chauliac observed that the disease spread from person to person, leading to recommendations for avoiding crowds and maintaining distance from the sick. These observations laid the groundwork for later understanding of infectious disease transmission. Though germ theory was still centuries away, some plague-era practices inadvertently helped slow transmission. The burning of victims' clothing and possessions may have destroyed flea habitats. The use of aromatic herbs and vinegar washes, while based on miasma theory, may have provided some protection through their insecticidal or antiseptic properties. The iconic plague doctor masks, with their long beaks stuffed with aromatic herbs, symbolized humanity's first systematic attempts to understand and combat invisible enemies. Though the miasma theory that guided their design was incorrect, the masks represented a crucial conceptual leap: the idea that disease could be prevented through deliberate human action rather than divine intervention alone. Medical education began to change as well. The traditional reliance on ancient texts like those of Galen proved inadequate when faced with a disease that classical authors had never encountered. Physicians were forced to observe, experiment, and innovate. The foundations of empirical medicine were laid in plague-ridden cities where theory met the harsh reality of mass death. Socially, the massive loss of life disrupted family structures and communities in ways that reverberated for generations. The demographic catastrophe created new social patterns and challenged traditional gender roles in unprecedented ways. Orphans multiplied as entire families were wiped out, creating a generation of children who grew up without the traditional structures of medieval society. These plague orphans often formed alternative family units based on survival rather than blood, creating new models of kinship and community. Widows, traditionally among the most vulnerable members of medieval society, suddenly found themselves inheriting property and businesses in unprecedented numbers. Many proved remarkably capable of managing these assets, challenging long-held assumptions about women's abilities and proper roles. The example of Christine de Pizan, widowed at 25 and left to support 3 children and her mother, became emblematic of plague-era female empowerment. Forced to earn a living through her writing, she became one of Europe's first professional female authors, producing works that explicitly defended women's intellectual capabilities. Traditional marriage patterns shifted dramatically. With so many potential partners dead, the usual restrictions on marriage loosened. Age gaps widened as young widows married older men and vice versa. Class boundaries became more permeable as the desperate living sought security over social propriety. Birth rates fluctuated wildly in the plague's aftermath. Initially, they plummeted as communities struggled to survive. Later, they often spiked as survivors sought to rebuild their families and communities. These demographic swings created generational imbalances that affected European society for decades. Migration patterns changed as well. Survivors often abandoned their devastated home communities for places that seemed to offer better opportunities. Entire regions were depopulated, while others experienced sudden influxes of plague refugees. This internal migration helped spread new ideas and practices across Europe. The guild system, cornerstone of medieval urban life, was forced to adapt or die. With so many craftsmen dead, guilds had to open their membership to previously excluded groups, including women and foreigners. These changes permanently altered the nature of medieval commerce and manufacturing. Perhaps most importantly, the Black Death forced humanity to confront mortality on a massive scale. It broke the illusion of control and exposed the fragility of life. This collective trauma influenced philosophy and worldview, leading to more secular, human-centered thinking that would eventually flower in the Renaissance. The medieval synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology, carefully constructed by scholars like Thomas Aquinas, crumbled under the weight of inexplicable suffering. If the world was rationally ordered and divinely governed, how could such chaos exist? Philosophers began to question not just specific doctrines, but the entire framework of medieval thought. The concept of fortune, long present in medieval thinking, but usually subordinated to divine providence, gained new prominence. Writers and thinkers increasingly portrayed human life as subject to random chance rather than divine plan. This shift toward acknowledging the role of fortune and contingency in human affairs was a crucial step toward modern thinking. The humanist movement, which would define Renaissance intellectual life, had its roots in plague-era disillusionment with traditional authorities. Thinkers like Petrarch, who lived through the plague years, began to emphasize human potential and achievement over divine grace and institutional authority. The scientific revolution that would transform European intellectual life in the following centuries was prefigured by plague-era medical observations and public health experiments. The willingness to question ancient authorities and test new approaches born from desperate necessity during the plague years, became a permanent feature of European intellectual culture. And yet, amidst all the despair and transformation, the story of survival emerged strongest of all. People learned to adapt to fear, to loss, to the unknown. They rebuilt their world, altered by the plague, but still recognizably human. The Black Death was indeed a chapter of devastation, but it was also, perhaps more importantly, a testament to human resilience and adaptability. Understanding this legacy is key to understanding survival itself. The plague did not just test bodies, it tested cultures, societies, and ideas. Those that survived did so not through strength alone, but through flexibility, innovation, and the courage to abandon what no longer worked in favor of what might. The world that emerged from the Black Death was not a return to what had been, but a step forward into something new. In that transformation lies perhaps the most important lesson of all. True survival requires not just enduring catastrophe, but learning from it, growing through it, and building something better on the ruins of what was lost. Next, we reach the final part of our journey. How do you survive the Black Plague, not just as a historical fact, but as a human being caught in the storm? The answer lies ahead in the hard-won wisdom of those who faced the unthinkable and lived to tell the tale. Part 10. Survival. Lessons from the Black Death. Surviving the Black Death wasn't just about avoiding the sickness. It was about navigating a world that had turned upside down, where death was constant, fear was everywhere, and trust was scarce. It was about how to keep your body, your mind, and your humanity intact when everything else was falling apart. The stories of survival from the plague years are not neat tales of heroism or simple medical advice. They are complex, often contradictory accounts of human beings, pushed to their absolute limits and forced to make impossible choices. Some survived through luck, others through wisdom, many through a combination of both. But all survivors shared certain characteristics, certain strategies that we can learn from even today. So what can we learn from those who lived through the nightmare? What practical wisdom can be extracted from the testimony of the dead and the memories of the living? The answers are neither simple nor comfortable, but they are real. They are forged in the fire of experience and tempered by the hammer of necessity. First, and most crucially, isolation was a shield, but it was a double-edged one that cut those who wielded it. Those who kept their distance from the infected had a demonstrably better chance of survival. This was not mere superstition, but observable fact, recorded by chroniclers across Europe who noted that hermits, isolated monasteries, and remote villages often escaped the worst of the plague's fury. Towns that enforced quarantines, however crude and brutal, often fared better than those that maintained normal contact patterns. Venice's 40-day quarantine for incoming ships became a model copied across the Mediterranean because it worked. Milan's harsh practice of sealing infected houses with their occupants inside was morally horrific but statistically effective. The survival rate in Milan was significantly higher than in cities that maintained normal social patterns. But isolation came at a terrible cost that went far beyond mere loneliness. It meant watching your neighbors die without offering help. It meant turning away desperate children whose parents had perished. It meant choosing your own survival over basic human compassion. Many who survived physically found themselves hollow shells, their humanity corroded by the choices they had made. The merchant Francesco Dottini, whose letters survive from the plague years, described the agony of this choice. He fled plague-ridden Florence for the countryside, taking only his closest family members and leaving servants and business partners behind. He survived, but his letters reveal a man haunted by guilt and tormented by the knowledge that his survival came at the expense of others. To survive, you had to balance the risk of contact with the need for food, water, and basic human connection. Complete isolation was rarely possible for more than a few weeks. Even the most determined hermits eventually needed supplies, and every contact carried risk. The key was minimizing contact while maintaining the bare minimum necessary for physical and psychological survival. Some survivors developed elaborate rituals around necessary contact. They would leave food at specific distances, communicate through shouts across courtyards, or conduct essential business through intermediaries. These practices, born from desperate creativity, represent some of humanity's first systematic approaches to controlling disease transmission. The psychological toll of isolation could be as deadly as the plague itself. Chroniclers noted increased rates of suicide and madness among survivors who had endured prolonged isolation. The human need for connection is not merely preference, but necessity. Those who survived long-term isolation often did so by maintaining some form of human contact, however limited or dangerous. Second, hygiene mattered, even when they didn't understand germs or disease transmission. The medieval understanding of disease was fundamentally flawed, built on theories of miasma and humoral imbalance that bore little relation to actual pathogen transmission. Yet many of the practices born from these incorrect theories accidentally provided real protection, burning the clothes and possessions of plague victims, while based on the belief that disease lingered in objects, actually destroyed flea habitats and reduced transmission vectors. The practice of washing hands in vinegar, though based on the theory that acid could neutralize corrupt air, may have provided some antimicrobial protection. Fumigating homes with burning herbs, while ineffective against airborne transmission, may have helped control insect populations. The aromatic preparations carried by plague doctors, stuffed into the beaks of their iconic masks, were based on the mistaken belief that bad smells caused disease. Yet some of these herbs, including thyme, rosemary, and garlic, have genuine antimicrobial properties that might have provided marginal protection. Even practices that seem purely superstitious may have had practical benefits. The common advice to avoid bathing during plague outbreaks, while hygienically counterproductive, may have reduced exposure if public baths were sites of transmission. The recommendation to sleep with windows closed, though it increased indoor air pollution, may have reduced contact with infected fleas. Every small precaution counted because the margin between life and death was often razor-thin. Chroniclers noted that families living side by side often had dramatically different outcomes, with one household completely wiped out while their neighbors survived intact. In such circumstances, even marginal protective measures could mean the difference between survival and extinction. The key insight from plague-era hygiene practices is that action, even imperfectly informed action, was better than passive acceptance. Communities that developed systematic responses to the plague, regardless of their scientific accuracy, generally fared better than those that simply accepted their fate. The act of trying to control the disease, even through misguided methods, seemed to confer some protection. Third, resilience was as vital as any medicine. perhaps more so. Mental strength, the ability to endure grief, isolation, and terror, was a hidden form of survival that often determined who lived and who simply gave up and died. The plague was not just a physical disease, but a psychological warfare campaign against human hope and sanity. Those who survived were not necessarily the strongest physically, but often those who could adapt their mental framework to accommodate unthinkable loss. They found ways to compartmentalize grief, to function despite terror, to maintain purpose when everything they had lived for was gone. The Florentine merchant Giovanni Morelli, who lost most of his family to the plague, survived by focusing obsessively on practical tasks. He kept detailed records of deaths, managed his business affairs, and maintained correspondence with other survivors. This focus on mundane activities provided psychological anchoring when emotional reality became too overwhelming to bear. Some survivors found solace in religious faith, interpreting their survival as divine purpose and their losses as mysterious but meaningful. Others abandoned faith entirely but found meaning in caring for other survivors or rebuilding their communities. The specific coping mechanism mattered less than having one at all. The ability to accept loss without being destroyed by it was crucial. Survivors learned to grieve quickly and move forward immediately. Extended mourning was a luxury that could prove fatal in a world where constant vigilance was necessary for survival. This emotional efficiency, while psychologically costly, was often the difference between life and death. Mental flexibility was equally important. Survivors were those who could abandon cherished beliefs and practices when they proved ineffective or dangerous. They could accept that the world had fundamentally changed and that old rules no longer applied. This cognitive flexibility allowed them to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances and seize opportunities for survival. Fourth, communities mattered, but they were double-edged swords that could save or damn their members. Even as many people abandoned their neighbors in terror, others risked everything to care for the sick, bury the dead, and provide comfort to the dying. Survival was often a collective effort, even when born from desperate self-interest rather than altruism. The most successful surviving communities were those that maintained basic social functions while adapting to plague conditions. They developed new leadership structures when traditional authorities died, created new economic systems when old ones collapsed, and found ways to care for vulnerable members without exposing everyone to unnecessary risk. The city of Nuremberg provides an excellent example of adaptive community survival. When the plague struck, city leaders immediately implemented strict quarantine measures, but also organized systematic care for orphans, food distribution for isolated households, and alternative economic arrangements for disrupted trades. The city maintained social cohesion while adapting to plague conditions, resulting in a relatively low death rate. Smaller communities often faced stark choices between collective survival and individual compassion. Villages that expelled infected members or refused entry to plague refugees often survived intact. Those that maintained traditional hospitality obligations often perished entirely. These choices, while morally complex, illustrate the harsh mathematics of survival in extreme circumstances. Religious communities provided some of the most striking examples of both collective survival and collective martyrdom. Some monasteries sealed themselves off completely and survived almost intact. Others maintained their traditional obligations to care for the sick and poor, resulting in near-complete mortality among the religious. The difference often came down to leadership decisions made in the crucial early days of local outbreaks. The survivors understood that community was essential for long-term survival, but had to be carefully managed during the acute crisis. They maintained social bonds while adapting social practices. They preserved essential community functions while abandoning dangerous traditions. This balancing act required constant vigilance and frequent, heartbreaking choices. Fifth, knowledge and adaptation saved lives. But it had to be the right kind of knowledge, constantly updated and ruthlessly practical. The plague doctors, flawed as they were, symbolized humanity's first systematic attempts to combat epidemic disease through organized knowledge rather than prayer alone. Their methods were often wrong, but their approach was revolutionary. Cities that learned from each successive wave of plague improved their responses dramatically. They developed better quarantine procedures, more effective record-keeping systems, and more sophisticated public health measures. Venice's quarantine protocols became increasingly elaborate and effective over successive plague outbreaks. Milan's isolation procedures were refined and systematized. Individual survivors were often those who observed patterns and adapted their behavior accordingly. They noticed that certain occupations had higher survival rates and switched professions. They observed that certain living arrangements seemed safer and modified their households accordingly. They tracked the disease's progress through their communities and adjusted their isolation strategies. The keeping of records, both official and personal, provided crucial survival information. Cities that maintained death records could track the disease's progress and adjust their responses accordingly. Individuals who kept careful notes about infection patterns in their neighborhoods could make better decisions about when to flee, when to isolate, and when it might be safe to resume normal activities. But knowledge had to be constantly updated and verified. Many traditional medical practices, while ineffective against the plague, persisted because they were backed by ancient authority. Survivors learned to privilege recent observation over traditional wisdom, practical results over theoretical correctness. The most successful survivors developed networks of information exchange with others in similar situations. Merchants maintained correspondence about plague conditions in different cities. Nobles exchanged information about safe routes and secure refuges. Religious leaders shared observations about effective protective measures. These information networks provided crucial intelligence for survival decisions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Black Death showed that survival is never guaranteed. It is fragile, temporary, and often breathtakingly unfair. The plague killed saints and sinners, rich and poor, young and old, with apparently random cruelty. No amount of preparation, wisdom, or virtue could guarantee survival. This harsh truth was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Yet, within this seemingly hopeless reality lay a profound revelation about human nature. The plague revealed not just humanity's vulnerability, but also its extraordinary capacity for adaptation, innovation, and persistence. People facing the worst imaginable circumstances still found ways to hope, to love, to create meaning, and to build for the future. The randomness of survival was both terrifying and liberating. If survival could not be guaranteed through virtue or wisdom, then it also could not be denied through poverty or powerlessness. The plague created opportunities for social mobility that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Peasants inherited noble estates. Women took over businesses. Outsiders found themselves in positions of authority. This democratic nature of plague survival contributed to the long-term social changes that followed. If God's will was truly inscrutable, if virtue provided no protection, if social hierarchy offered no immunity, then perhaps human society needed to be organized on different principles entirely. The survivors who thrived in the post-plague world were often those who embraced this uncertainty rather than fighting it. They built flexible strategies rather than rigid plans. They maintained hope without illusions. They prepared for the worst while working for the better. As we look back across the centuries, the plague is not just a distant horror, but a mirror reflecting our own capacity for both destruction and creation. It reminds us that catastrophe is always possible, that the foundations of civilization are more fragile than we like to believe, but also that human beings possess remarkable powers of adaptation and renewal. The Black Death showed that survival is not just about avoiding death, but about carrying life forward in all its complexity. The survivors did not just preserve their own existence, they preserved and transmitted the possibility of human flourishing. They maintained art, learning, love, and hope even in the face of seemingly insurmountable horror. Their legacy lives in every quarantine protocol, every public health measure, every systematic response to epidemic disease. It lives in our understanding that knowledge must be constantly updated, that communities must balance individual and collective needs, that survival often requires abandoning cherished beliefs and practices. But perhaps most importantly, their legacy lives in the simple fact that they refused to give up. When the world seemed to be ending, when death stalked every street and touched every family, when hope itself seemed like a form of madness, they kept going. They buried their dead, cared for their living, and built for a future they might not live to see. This is the history they don't want you to know. Not just the facts and figures, the death tolls and dates, but the deeper truth about human nature revealed in extremity. The truth that we are more fragile than we admit, but also more resilient than we imagine. The truth that survival is never guaranteed, but never impossible. The stories buried deep, the secrets left unspoken, the lessons written in blood and tears across the landscape of the past. Subscribe and uncover what they tried to erase. Because in understanding how our ancestors survived the unthinkable, we prepare ourselves for whatever unthinkable challenges may yet come. The past never rests, and neither should we. For in that restlessness lies our salvation, our adaptation, our survival. The Black Death ended, but its lessons live on. In every choice we make about risk and safety, community and isolation, hope and despair, we are still, in some sense, learning how to survive the plague.